Having a quorum, I would like to open the September 2nd, 2010 meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Planning Commission. Ms. Rodriguez, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Larson.
Here.
Commissioner Jordan.
Here.
Commissioner Jacobs. Commissioner Jostes.
Here.
Chair Bartlett.
Here. Under preliminary matters, our first action will be to review the minutes and resolutions. Are there any comments to the draft minutes of August 19th, 2010? Ms. Lodge.
Mr. Chair, I move the approval of the minutes as presented.
Well, let's go through the resolution as well. We'll do
Oh.
one combined motion.
Okay, yes, and approve the resolution as well.
Okay. All right. Having no comments on the minutes, are there any comments on the resolution 010-10 for 2501 through 2511 Medcliff Road? Okay, seeing no comments, I have a motion for approval of the minutes and resolutions. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
Not-
Mr. Jostes.
not being at the meeting, I abstain.
Great, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, I was recused from that, so I also will abstain.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Cato, are there any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items?
No, there are not.
Any announcements and appeals?
No.
Okay, with that, I would like to open public comment for any items that are not on today's agenda. If anyone likes to speak, please come forward. Seeing no one, I'll close public comment, and we will open with our first item, which is a consent item for 1220 Shoreline Drive. And Kelly Broderson will be doing the staff report unless there's a motion to waive the staff report. Mr. Jostes.
Mr. Chair, I move the Planning Commission request staff to waive the reading of the staff report.
I second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay. Is there any public comment for this item? Okay, with that, I'll bring it back to the commission if there's any questions, or we'll roll directly into our comments. Mr. Jostes.
Mr. Chair, my only comment is that I think the design of this addition is an appropriate one, and by moving the balcony to face the more of the driveway than the private space of the adjacent residents certainly helps protect the neighborliness of this project. So I'm in support of the project.
Thank you. Ms. Schwartz, your light was on, and I see it's off now. You're fine. Okay, if there are no other comments on the project, I would look forward to a motion. Mr. Jostes again.
Mr. Chair, move approval of the coastal development permit as described in the staff report with the findings to be made as indicated in the staff report.
Great, thank you.
A second.
Second by Mr. Jordan. Any further discussion or comment? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, the project is approved, and this is appealable within 10 days. Thank you very much for a very clean application. Thank you very much. Okay, our next item is a new item, item 4. This is 15 East Cabrillo Boulevard.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Jostes.
I'm going to need to step down on this item because my wife's family owns property in the vicinity, and I feel that it would be inappropriate to participate in this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And our case planner is Dan Gullett. He will be doing the staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. This project proposal includes a partial demolition and second-story addition to the Rusty's Lighthouse building at the corner of Cabrillo and Helena. The net increase in building area would be 573 square feet, and there would be a net decrease in outdoor seating area of 100 square feet. The proposal also includes a partial remodel of the restaurant, a new trash enclosure on the neighboring property, new creekside landscaping, and drainage improvements. The city is actually the applicant on this proposal. This project is related to the Cabrillo Bridge replacement project, which I'll describe momentarily. Required applications are 2 front setback modifications for encroachment into the 20-foot front setbacks on East Cabrillo and Helena, and a coastal development permit. This image shows the vicinity of the Rusty's Lighthouse restaurant. The restaurant's located at this corner. This is Helena and East Cabrillo, and footprints of buildings in the vicinity. The parking for Rusty's is provided by an off-site parking agreement, 3 parcels up State Street. There's no proposed change to the number of seating in the restaurant, so no additional parking is required for the project. This is an aerial photograph of the same vicinity, and then a close-up of the building. So you can see from here that a portion of the building is actually located above Mission Creek, this patio area, and this portion of the building here. And this is a view from the State Street Bridge, and you can see that portion of the building above the creek. For some background, the Cabrillo Bridge project was reviewed and approved by the Planning Commission back in July 2007. That project included the partial demolition and replacement of Rusty's building in its same location to facilitate replacement of the structurally deficient Cabrillo Bridge. The project also included replacement of the channel walls below the bridge and a rebuild of the Mission Creek banks as part of the Lower Mission Creek Flood Control Project. The project also included right-of-way improvements, including sidewalk on the frontages of the subject properties. And this is a close-up of where the patio actually connects to the bridge. As part of the Cabrillo Bridge replacement project, this portion of the building was approved to be rebuilt and look the same as it does now, but it would actually be cantilevered and not dependent on a structural connection to the bridge. So the city's been working with the property owner to come up with a more desirable solution. This is the site plan, Helena Street, Cabrillo. Here's the lighthouse, and you can barely make out the outline of the existing patio, and this is where the building is above the creek. So the project includes peeling back this portion of the building to be parallel with the creek channel, and there would be a 8-foot vegetated setback where there is none currently. This shows the outline of where the improvements would be on the building. The project also includes a balcony on the second story here and a trash enclosure on the neighboring property. Currently there are trash carts that are just open in this parking lot, and these would enclose those. That's located approximately 56 feet from the creek wall. And all of these improvements are actually included in the Cabrillo Bridge project. These areas show the 20-foot HRC2 setbacks. These apply to all buildings that are 15 feet tall or taller. And you can see there's, along Helena Street, there's a 0 setback line. So this hatched area is what encroaches on Helena Street, and then you can see the slight hatched area that encroaches from Cabrillo. So this is the existing condition with the existing building, and this is what would be left with this project. So benefits from this project include pulling the structure approximately 30 feet back on the western side. So that would be, this is about 30 feet at this point. The project daylights the creek and provides a vegetated buffer, which wasn't provided before, a trash enclosure, and stormwater treatment and retention consistent with a stormwater management program. Staff believes the front setback modifications to be appropriate due to the existing encroachments, the HLC support of this design, and because the project facilitates bridge replacement and the creek project. As outlined in the staff report, staff's position is the project is consistent with the policies of the Coastal Act and the local coastal program, including water and marine environments, locating new development, and visual quality. So staff therefore recommends that the Planning Commission approve the project subject to the conditions in Exhibit A and making the findings in Section 7 of the staff report. And that concludes staff's presentation, and we're available for questions.
Great. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to open the floor to the applicant for their presentation.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Richard Six of Lenvick and Minor, and I'm very pleased to be not only the city's architect, but the Casanola's architect and the Rusty's architect on this win-win project. First of all, Dan has outlaid the greater picture of things, so I will concentrate on the architecture. Get my bearings here. Whoa. Not working. Okay. I can handle it. First of all, we need to primarily remember what the nature of the funding of this project is. It's from the federal government in doing the bridge project. So we have carefully limited our modifications to the building to the creek side of the building, where the modifications are necessary for the bridge project. On the north side, that contains the expensive restrooms and the majority of the kitchen, we will be minimizing our alterations because it is outside the effects of the bridge project. Fortunately, the adjacent property is owned by the Casanolas also, so we'll be taking great advantage of that. And as Dan has mentioned, we will first be enclosing some exposed existing trash bins right here into a new trash enclosure as far away from the creek as possible. That will radically improve the stormwater management situation and also clean up views from State Street and from the restaurant above. Secondly, because the adjacent property is owned by the same owner, we will be enhancing and softening the hard edge of the building right against the property line by establishing overhangs for balconies, overhangs onto the adjacent property for roofs, and allowing openings unprotected right against the property line. Thirdly, when we put the second floor positioned right here, we will be required to have an exit on this side of the building. So we will also be creating an agreement to have emergency access easement out to State Street along that property. Also, we've been able to add additional landscaping in this little triangular area. This is the Helena elevation, and as I said, this is away from the necessary requirements of the bridge project, so there will be little, if any, modifications to this elevation. The only exception is that the extent of the overall remodel triggers the full ADA compliance. So we will be introducing a handicap ramp in the service area here to serve some existing and required exit out of that area. This is the elevation at right angles to Cabrillo. At the HLC, there was concern that the tower is not historically Spanish, and there was even comments that to get rid of it entirely. But however, Alex Bugeaud was very insightful and persuasive when he said, this is a folly, an architectural folly. We shouldn't be so serious about our Spanish architecture. And that seemed to win the day. The one thing that is disappointing about the tower is the small and awkward opening at the base. So what I have done is I have introduced a new, more elegant entry at the side of the tower that's walking into a 1.5-story volume with a stair and balcony beyond. It was very important, this volume is very important to the HLC because it's adjacent and hugs the tower and integrates the tower better with the new massing. This is the creek at the building at right angles to the creek. This is where we see the full 2-story volume of first and second floor dining. This elevation, it benefits from the 8-foot wide by continuously long new landscape at its base. The awkward angles of the creek alignment I was able to reduce by lowering this roof and carving out the second story of the balcony to express on the top layer a very traditional rectangular box with peaked roof. The square openings, the wrought iron balcony, the arched openings below, the scale of it is reminiscent of the copper coffee pot mid-state, some of the elevation of that. So that's kind of the scale and arrangement of the openings. This is from State Street and 140 feet back. Here we see the open-air balcony, and this point right here is the highest point of the building, right directly above the elevator shaft, and it is pushed purposely back from the exterior into the center of the building to minimize its mass. I was able to lower the roof plates above the descending stair in this area, and from here to the left is the existing and unaltered arched parapet. And then to full circle, as I mentioned the trash earlier, this is the new trash enclosure from State Street adjacent to the neighboring property. So that is my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you very much for being concise and complete. So,
All right, thank you.
is there any other presentation from the applicant staff side at this point? Okay, Danny, do we have any public speaker slips on this one? Okay, I will open public comment. Looks like we have just one speaker. That would be Eddie Harris. If you could please come up.
Good afternoon, Chair Bartlett, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Eddie Harris, and I'm president of the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council. And as you are aware, the Mission Creek estuary at this location is a very important natural asset for Santa Barbara. It's environmentally sensitive habitat. The fate and the future of many species are dependent on the treatment of the buffer space here and throughout the estuary. And it's easy to look at this project and say, well, it's a step in the right direction, so let's do it. But it's a very small step. This is a very highly constricted location. Historically, the natural resource here has been maligned by those types of constrictions. And it's a real question. Is an 8-foot setback here adequate? The removal of the patio deck is good, but can we do better? I agree with the City Creeks Division that a 25-foot setback here would be appropriate. It would be of much benefit to the resource and protective. Can this be accomplished perhaps by being creative here and transferring density entitlements away from the creek? It's a question that I pose, and I don't know if this has been considered or not. Also, another point here that I would like to raise is that there's a need to provide space for better and safer access to allow cleaning and maintenance of the estuary. It's a very difficult part of the estuary to access, and I think as the future unfolds and more of the long-range vision for Mission Creek is put in place, it's currently now real important to be able to clean that part of the creek. It's beneficial to the species that live there, including endangered species, because a lot of harmful trash and materials accumulate there. And in addition to that, it would benefit the tourist industry to have a better resource there for visually for people to look at and admire. So I raise that question, and I think there's a real need there to provide more space to make a ramp or some type of better access for cleaning. And in closing, I just want to say that I'd like to hear answers to these questions. Perhaps the City Creeks and the Citizens Advisory Committee might be a better or an appropriate vehicle, put it that way, to explore some of these questions. Thank you.
Before you leave the podium, I have a quick question. Were you able to comment back in 2007 when we had the bridge improvement project in front of us? Were you involved at that point?
Yes.
Okay, great. And thank you for your letter as well.
Thank you.
If there's no other public comment, I will close the public comment and bring it back to the commission for questions and then comments. And I think today I would like to change it up a bit. I think I'd like to maybe start the questions on my right with Commissioner Schwartz, and then we can maybe start our comments from the other end with Commissioner Jordan. So we can always change it, but I think we'll try it this way just to mix it up. So Ms. Schwartz, do you have some questions for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, too, have, of my questions, the same questions as this member of the public posed. And I don't know if we should take it back to you, Mr. Gullett, or if it's part of the negotiations, Mr. Wiley, in terms of how we arrived at, number one, the setback parameters, And then within the sizing and siting of the new building or renovated building, how do we get access to appropriately maintain and clean the improved creek area once the bridge project goes through? So, Mr. Gullett, perhaps you could guide us as to who's best positioned to answer those questions. And then I have a separate one for the applicant after that.
The city engineer, Pat Kelly, is best to respond.
Thank you, Commission and Commissioner Schwartz. Is that, could you redirect your question specifically to a question for myself? Could you restate your question, please?
Sure. The first one is about setbacks, and there's the staff recommended or the negotiated setback, and in your opinion, is that sufficient vis-a-vis the comment that we had and the concern we just heard from a member of the public?
Yes. The position that we're in is that we have an approved project with an overhang. And as part of the discussions with the property owners, we came up with an opportunity to daylight the building. If this daylighting is, as proposed, is not successful, we risk going back to the status quo, which we simply have replacing the bridge over the creek. We've had a significant amount of discussion within the within staff. I believe the consensus, and we have representatives from the Creeks Committee here, is that the final staff consensus was the 8-foot was sufficient. And Creeks is here to respond to that if you have any further questions regarding that.
Okay, that would be helpful to hear from our Creeks representative as to whether or not you two are in support of the 8-foot parameter.
Hello, my name is George Johnson. I work for the Creeks Division. Commissioner Schwartz, we, through the review process, had recommended a 25-foot setback, and we felt that that was the minimum that would serve to protect water resources and environmental habitat in this area. It's consistent with the project across the street, the new hotel over there, and so at least once the flood control improvements are made, it will be 25 feet at that hotel. So that's what we recommended, and then the planning division as well as Public Works agreed that a smaller setback would be adequate for that. But we still believe at the Creeks Division that a larger setback would be better for habitat purposes. It's just that was what was agreed upon through them, and that was our recommendation, but it's just a recommendation. It's not always followed up on.
And again, let me just pose this to whoever from staff might be most appropriate. It might be our bridge expert, who I see is here with us today. How do we currently get access to cleaning and caring for that creek area, and will that need to change with this project? Because I agree that it's a sensitive area, and visually, let alone structurally, needs some significant improvement. I think that's part of the intention of this project.
Planning Commission and Commissioner Schwartz, it's my understanding that the flood control essentially has never needed to maintain this site. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I've been working on the Lower Mission Creek project for the 17 years I've been here at the city, and have been through much of the discussion over many years as to how would you go about. And essentially, my understanding is that the cleaning of the creek is highly regulated. And right now, I understand it's limited to essentially the detritus that is washed up on the lagoon, and that and maybe George can speak to this more precisely, is that I'm not aware of going into the water and doing any maintenance within the water.
Commissioner Schwartz, we have gone in when the water's a little lower. It depends on the mouth of the lagoon. If it's open, then the water level gets lower, and you can access some parts of the lagoon by walking up from down below, but you need hip waders because it's you're still going to get wet up to your hip, and so we've been able to get in there and remove trash that way. But Otherwise, it is pretty difficult because just the water depth and the lagoon is constrained at that location. So even if you were to get an access down to it, you would probably still end up getting wet to remove trash and debris in there.
So it is within our scope of authority, maybe not direct responsibility, but we can go in and do that when we monitor it and see that there's a need, it triggers a need.
Right. If we're seeing a lot of trash in there, then we get down in there and try to get that out of there. But it is difficult. We have to wait kind of for the appropriate time.
And speaking further to your question, is that the Lower Mission Creek project, the upstream portion of the channel between Cabrillo and State, is essentially as part of the bridge project. We are building that first section, that first reach of the originally proposed Lower Mission Creek project. Because oddly enough, the project as defined, Lower Mission Creek project as defined, ends at the face of the bridge. So the bridge itself is not part of the project. I say this because it is in the context of your question. And as part of the development of the Lower Mission Creek project, the flood control who will take over the maintenance of the channel did not propose or has considered the need for having a access point at that location.
Okay, thank you. My other question is for the applicant, maybe Mr. Six, the architect. Regarding the lighthouse element, I know it's gone through some design iterations from watching the HLC meetings. Was there an interest by the property owner to remove this element as the design of the new Rusty's took shape into what I would characterize as less of a nautical look and more of a Spanish style?
No, not at all. Commissioner Schwartz, not at all. The tower was built and funded by the operator, Rusty's, and neither party, property owner or the operator, want to have it removed. So, and I think there was only two HLC commissioners that objected or had problems with.
Will there
the
be a
tower.
functional purpose to the lighthouse, or will it be
It will
sort
still
of more
remain
ornamental?
Ornamental will still remain as an entrance. So it's ornamental. Have you ever been through there? It's a lot of fun.
But I didn't know as part of the new plan whether there's
Yeah,
a
there'll
kind of
be
a
two-
repurposing of sorts.
There will be two entrances. So one thematic and one more elegant. Now in the future, this building is going to be here for a long time, and there might be a different operator who would, and it was suggested that perhaps that opening, the tower opening, could become a window and so forth, so it could be minimized. So there's places to go. You have to look at the
So the two
lawn.
entrances, just in looking at your design, it'll be one on Cabrillo and the other will be angled to Helena or on Helena?
The existing is
The
angled.
existing angled, okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Ms. Larson, I believe you have questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of them have already been asked. For Mr. Six, we're going to put you through your paces today. Are the patio seats? I saw that the seat count, I believe, was 148 for the restaurant, and that includes the patio seats along the creek, or is that all interior count?
Mr. Larson, that's including the exterior seats also.
Okay, thank you. And is there a gain or loss of seats for
No.
the? Okay. And the back of house kind of area where the loading dock is and that sort of thing. Could you go over any improvements that are going to happen in that area real quick?
Yes. Let's see here. The only improvement, Commissioner Larson, is the handicap ramp that will be descending here to the street, it is a necessary requirement of the ADA. So that's all.
And on the field trip, there were trash cans back there and some other
Yes.
stuff, and
That all remains the same, yeah. That's outside.
Can an enclosure be provided in that area for the trash or some way?
It would be very difficult, but it could be studied again. It would stretch
Okay.
it's away from the bridge project, so it would be dicey whether that could be funded or considered part of the
Oh, I
funding.
see. Okay. All right. Thank you. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Larson. Okay,
Chair,
Ms.
Chair Bartlett,
Yes.
I'm wondering if I could possibly address some questions that Commissioner Schwartz raised. Or
Okay,
some
I think
issues-
we're going to ask the question you're about to answer, so please go ahead.
Okay, good. I hope I'm going to answer it. Just, and it has to do with the setback and the extent, or really the extent of the changes to this building. And just by way of quick background, I've been here long enough that I was directly involved in most all of the acquisitions for Paseo Nuevo, the redevelopment agency acquisitions for Paseo Nuevo, which actually involved the construction of Lot 2 above Nordstrom's and the construction of structure number 10 below. So there were a lot of acquisitions. And one of the things we learned in the city attorney's office and in the redevelopment staff was it's better to talk to the owners and to work with the owners than to fight with the owners. Because the lawyers and the appraisers on both sides will get very much involved, and it's a tremendous waste to be spending that kind of money on litigation and all the experts and lawyers needed. And there was some of that, fortunately pretty minimal in Paseo Nuevo. But we learned, whether it was the Canfield building and Andy Dunn, or the White House building, and I can't remember the owner's name offhand, or the Betty's Fabric building, the Pilkingtons, or down here, these antique shops, we learned to work closely with those owners and figure out, well, what are you looking to get out of this project, recognizing that we have to get the public project accomplished as well. And I think as Mr. Kelly mentioned, or as Mr. Gullett mentioned, in 2007, what was approved as part of the bridge, and let me say, we got to replace this bridge. It's gonna. Well, I shouldn't overstate that. We got to replace. Let me just say, we have to replace this bridge. The federal government, as you know, all over the country, is funding these things, and that's administered by the State Department of Transportation. So, in a way, we've got a four-way negotiation here. I got involved because of my experience and because of just my belief that you have to work with the property owners. I have to say the Castagnola family has been great about this. They really have wanted to work with the city. They appreciate and understand as much as anybody that we have to replace this bridge. And this is one of the oddest situations I've ever seen with this bridge. Private property, private improvements, or the private improvements, the private building is attached to a public bridge, and it's a little bit like delicate surgery trying to disconnect these things and to do it to everyone's satisfaction, and to not have it really cost an arm and a leg and everything else. So in 2007, what was approved was what we called the status quo project. Somehow we would take this all apart, build the bridge, we'd have to be in the creek and get that all done, and then put it back. And the Castagnola family said, okay, well, you're putting us back in the status quo. It's going to be at the public expense. That in a way was fine. But as we talked to them more, they said, it would sure make a whole lot more sense to just do a better building here, to hire a good architect, and to go up a bit, and to not have this thing jutting out over the creek. And I understand. We understand where Creeks is coming from. Well, their policy and their belief generally is it should be at least a 25-foot setback. But frankly, that would require the demolition of this building. And talk about costing an arm and a leg. And I have to say, the Castagnola family, the sisters that we've been dealing with, Mrs. Hunter and her sister Renee, they're real clear, and it's understandable. We're not developers. When someone talks about transfer of development rights, it's like, what does that mean? Can you just, give us back our building? and we'll be fine with that. So it's very understandable and appropriate for them to say they're not developers, they're not interested in some elaborate scheme with the city. They would just like a very nice building back. And so we've gotten to what Mr. Six called our win-win situation. It really is. But on the city side, we're still dealing with the state and the federal government and trying to explain to them why this is so expensive as it is. It's a great idea, I think. It is expensive, and we can't satisfy every particular need here. But this is improvement, as even Mr. Harris conceded. So I hope that helps explain.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Jacobs, you have your light on, and
actually,
now you can ask the question.
well, one
now
of
that
my
we have
main
the answer.
questions, it's actually been answered, but I wanted to clarify for everyone why Mr. Wiley is here, and it's because the city's the applicant. This is a mitigation measure for the bridge. And I did have, like Ms. Larson, a question about the trash enclosures. The funk zone is always so impacted by every change because it is just like sardines packed into a can. You can't hardly wiggle one without impacting another. So any even incremental improvement truly is appreciated. So question-wise, there was a trash enclosure. I did have a question about public restrooms. And is there a public restroom in this, or is it? It's not. It's for customers, and there's nothing there for that. Okay. And that's pretty much it in terms of questions. And I'm glad to see Mr. Six here today. Always a pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the Creek staff, I'm sorry, I didn't get your last name. You mentioned a different a 25-foot setback further up the creek, the other side of State Street.
Yes.
What is that? I forget the name of the Harbor Inn.
Yes, it's the Harbor Inn.
The Harborview Inn. Okay, so that does have the 25-foot setback.
The setback's actually larger right now, but when the flood control project is built, when the wall is built to expand the width of the creek in that location, it will be 25 feet at that time.
And what happens to the creek downstream from there? Does it get widened as well?
Mr. Kelly may be able to answer.
Okay, Mr. Kelly.
Commissioner Lodge, the width of the channel essentially remains the same as it exists right now. The small exception is that on the southwest corner, there'll be a slight widening, much of that to accommodate the bridge abutments, and then a slight widening at that location there because the construction plan is to essentially build new abutments behind the existing abutments to try to accelerate the construction method and minimizing delay and the construction time on Cabrillo Boulevard. So that's the purpose of the slightly wider channel.
Perhaps I'm not understanding what's going on here, but it sounds as if it's actually going to be wider and then constricted more as it comes down, or it will be the same width all the way down to the city.
The intent is to maintain the existing width as much as possible and then make an accommodation at the new bridge. And the new bridge will be slightly wider than the existing bridge.
Okay. Thank you. And then there was mention about improved drainage. Is that how's that stormwater and treatment? Where is that going to be handled, Mr. Gullett?
Mr. Chair, the stormwater management, best management practices included in the project include a bioswale along the parking lot here, and then a bioswale in front of the building. So the roof drains would actually drain into this bioswale here, and then there would be sheet flow into the bioswale above the creek. Okay. So the stormwater management program requires that the project retain and treat the 1-inch 24-hour storm, and this meets that requirement.
And that's how that will be handled. Okay, thank you. There's been discussion in the general plan update and elsewhere generally about creek setbacks, and well, I guess this is more of a comment, but I'm not sure how, without great expense and simply taking the building, that we can achieve the 25-foot setback. But, okay, thank you.
Mr. Jordan, do you have any questions?
I could work up a couple. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kelly, while we have you warmed up, my recollection from years ago is that while the design of the channel and the bridge is roughly going to stay the same size, there's something in the support that will, the new design of the supports that improves both the capacity and the flow of the water. Isn't that correct?
Commissioner Jordan, that's correct. The bridge will be slightly wider, and instead of having 3 spans, we'll only have 2 spans. And existing 1 span in alignment, where the central bent is in alignment. Currently, we have 3 bridges, one I think built in 1924, another one in 1928, and another one in the 80s, and each one has a little bit of a different angle, so the hydraulic efficiency will be better.
Yep, that's what I remembered. Thanks. I guess while we have both the attorneys here, I'll ask what I'm going to call my Bath Street question again, and that's the short version is a land use decision a land use decision? In this particular case, there's obviously a dynamic in existence on taking apart or reducing or attempting to reduce a private property or an approved private property entitlement for a public improvement, and to what extent does that dynamic begin to play in the land use decision? Is it a positive that goes along with it, or again is just a land use decision just a land use decision?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Jordan, I remember our conversation on the Bath Street project, but I'm not getting the question of a land use decision in the sense. Could you?
Well, I guess in the context of there's dynamic. There's a paragraph there's more than a paragraph in the staff report on the dynamics involved with what the federal government will pay, what the property owner is going to lose, how that all works together. And so I guess the crux of it for me is if we're increasing the setback from a negative number now to a positive number of 8 or 11 feet, whatever it is, but if the stance of some in the room is that that number should actually be 25 feet, is there adequate reimbursement available through those project funds to remedy the loss of that property for the property owner? Or does the consideration really weigh in at just getting it to the point where the project funds will reimburse the property owner for the relocation of that square footage?
Okay.
That makes sense?
Sure. And what I'll do is I'll defer to the first part of your question first, because I think Mr. Wiley has the answer to that part of it.
Okay.
I think the answer is that our understanding is that the federal government is not prepared to pay for the demolition of this building, and a 25-foot setback would, because of its impact on the kitchen and the building, and I can tell you just the property owner, if I were them, I would say this is severance damages that amount to a total taking of our property, and you owe us all that the property's worth, and the fact that we've been left with a small parcel, and you can't just leave a little bit of a building. That wouldn't make any sense. So we're caught between the funding authority saying that's not necessary, we won't pay for that, the need to do this bridge, redo this bridge. And I will add, and I guess this really wasn't the question you were asking, but if you were to ask the city attorney if this planning commission has the legal authority to impose a 25-foot setback in this case, I would tell you no. I would tell you that sounds almost exactly like the facts of the case called Dolan versus the city of Tigard, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, where the city of Tigard ended up paying a lot of money to a hardware store, small hardware store. And this case always struck me because this is a run-of-the-mill planning commission case. small hardware store trying to expand, and the city said, you know, you're next to a creek, we want a setback, and we want a bike path. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that's a takings, that's a physical invasion. And why? Because the record didn't support the Planning Commission. And why didn't the record support the Planning Commission? Because they pulled it out of thin air. There was no city ordinance that required that setback. There was no city policy that the setback or the bike path. It was what lawyers call an ad hoc exaction, meaning it just seemed like a great idea at the time. But when exactions like that really have to have a detailed, nexus demonstration before they can be legal, before they can be constitutional, as opposed to what lawyers call a programmatic exaction, which is where there's an ordinance. And there's a history in this city with respect to creek setbacks, and I think it's, about 10 years ago now, we tried to do an ordinance on creek setbacks and got shot down pretty effectively by members of the public. It's an issue that remains out there. I think it's a general plan issue in a sense. At some point, we need to deal with new development, and that's why the Harbor View Inn has a 25-foot setback. But it's a different story altogether when you're dealing with existing development.
Okay, thank you. I think that answers both halves of my question. And just curiosity, was there ever any part of the negotiations that involved the city looking to purchase the entire property?
Yes, and I should have said, or made it real clear, the status quo project, when we looked at the expense of that, it was very expensive, probably as expensive as this. And then the question became, particularly when the Castagnolas families, well, we're not thrilled with the status quo either. Why waste all that money taking it apart? And it's really tremendous. You come in there and cut it all off and get it out of the way while the bridge is being done, and then to just put it back in a cantilevered fashion that's disconnected. That was very expensive and ultimately very wasteful because nobody wanted to do it. So we said, well, should we talk about acquiring all the property? And again, the Castagnola family has said, this is our living, this is our income. We're not developers, we're not looking to go invest in the market. We're just landlords running, and that's very understandable. And it's like, so the answer was, we don't want to sell you the building. We don't, and so it's hard to argue with that.
Understandably. Thank you. Mr. Gullett, could you review for me again the parking lot that's on the other side of the building, the little wedge one? I think, or just confirm for me what I think you said on the site visit, that the parking that takes place there has no bearing on the parking requirements for Rusty's. Is that correct?
That's correct. So this is not assigned parking or required parking, I should say, for anyone. I understand the beach house uses this parking lot currently.
And also then the beach house, it's not part of their parking requirement either.
That's correct.
Okay. And then the trash enclosures that we're talking about that go on that parking lot, those are trash enclosures for the beach house, not for Rusty's, correct?
That's right, yeah. Okay. Rusty's trash areas in their loading dock.
Okay. And then while you're up there, I still have some confusion on that Helena sidewalk, and it's really better in my packet than it is up there on there. But as you're coming away from State Street, that sidewalk is wide, it has a gutter, and then as soon as it hits that driveway thing, it jogs, it either ends, the curb ends, the sidewalk gets smaller, and it looks like the sidewalk is replaced at that time on the width of that driveway by the driveway apron itself, the existing driveway ramp. And is that way because of the height or elevation constraints there, or why does that sidewalk not continue to the end of the property with a normal sidewalk with a driveway cutout?
So the improvements we see on this site plan are improvements that go along with the bridge project, as I said before. So this is not the existing condition, but it's what's proposed. So this would be a 6-foot sidewalk, and like you say, it would end at the loading dock, and there's currently no sidewalk above here on Helena Street.
And so what is the reason that the sidewalk ends at the loading dock rather than the sidewalk continue to the end of the property with a driveway, apron, in the street like you would normally see for any driveway?
I wasn't involved in the right-of-way review with the bridge project, but I can speculate that since this is essentially a curb cut from the end of the sidewalk to the end of the property line, it really couldn't accommodate a sidewalk across there because there's loading and unloading that occurs at this location.
Okay. Mr. Kelly, did you have anything else there? Or I saw you stirring.
Planning Commission and Commissioner Jordan, just to follow up with what Dan had said is correct, and to add on to it is that north of that site there is no sidewalk, and there is the difficulty of making the conform, and the simpler conform to the existing improvements would just be to stop at the driveway. So the bridge project just moves up. It's a simple sidewalk. Once you get to the driveway, it gets more complex, and then we're looking at, what's the benefit of that complexity and cost to the bridge, the nexus to the bridge. We didn't see any, especially when there's no sidewalk to the north. But if there's if we have an opportunity to do a simple sidewalk project and stretch the nexus to an existing public works project, namely the bridge, even though it's far away, we'll do our best to do it. And we just kind of lost the nexus there at the driveway.
I guess my confusion there is there will be a sidewalk to the north of that someday when La Entrada appears. But so we will have, coming from the north, you'll have a sidewalk that ends at that property line from the north. You'll have this little thing of a cement slab loading ramp thing, and then a resumption again of a sidewalk. Is that the way you anticipate that would look then?
I actually just looked at the Entrada plans earlier this week, and they include sidewalk improvements down to the parking lot for Rusty's. So there would be a gap between the Rusty's parking lot and this other Rusty's property.
And then if you maybe go back to the site plan, I'm sorry, I forgot my pointer. I'm sure it's tormenting a cat at home with one of the kids, probably. But why, thank you. I have to learn how to use it. Okay. On the revegetated area between the unused parking lot and the creek there, that the line there that you see that's coming off of the parking lot, would that line be, before the vegetation starts, would that line be be equivalent to where the hardscape stops now? So the parking lot itself would continue, that line right there, that would roughly represent where the hardscape is now, and then the vegetation would start?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I may add, is that little triangular space is additional landscaping. That is additional landscaping.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. And I have just a couple of quick questions more on phasing, implementation, and sort of the funding contractual end of this. Does the Rusty's revision need to occur prior to the bridge? Is it going to be handled all as one project simultaneous, or is it separate contracts where the Castagnolas are paying for something on their building and being reimbursed, or is it all being kind of put out to bid by the city? I'm just trying to understand how this interplays with the bridge construction. So,
the answer is we're still working on that.
Okay.
Trying to think of the latest plan, and I have to say, this has been more internal. We haven't really broached this one thing at a time. We haven't really broached this with the Castagnolas yet, but we were thinking of separate contracts and doing the work, getting the demolition done and the improvements over the creek out of the way, going forward with the bridge and the bridge contract, and getting, that's going to be in two parts, right. One side and then the other, and then a contractor coming back, a general contractor coming back to rebuild the restaurant building.
So probably separate contracts then,
Yeah.
but sort
Yeah.
of overlapping on the phasing to allow the bridge to occur then.
That's our thinking.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, that helps a lot.
The only thing I could possibly add to that is that the demolition will be one of the first items of work because the demolition of the bridge, since the building is attached to the bridge, we have to demolish both.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. That helps. We're just trying to anticipate how long it's all going to be torn up because obviously it's going to be awkward with all the detours. So Mr. Jordan, you get to go first if you want on comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I in general agree with what I've heard from Creeks and from Urban Creeks Council that it's a good step, but whether or not it's a good enough step is still a question. But I take that with and then balance that against the advice that Mr. Wiley offered, and I think it's a good enough step. A couple of comments I have. The easiest one quickly is on the in the conditions, Mr. Gullett, for construction hours, and I think you ought to chat with either the property users or the property owners and look into also a Friday restriction on Monday holiday weekends. I know that's kind of like just a formatted template you guys use, but this particular location has a huge impact if you have people working down there on a Friday when it's a Monday holiday, and there might be some sense to figuring out when those weekends are and then stopping Friday work also, and just free that area up a little bit from both an aesthetics and a tourism use standpoint. I think this begins to remedy past mistakes. I think the positives of the bridge improvement certainly outweigh to most extents the limited opportunities for setback. I agree that looking for a larger setback basically just decimates this building, and if somebody had wanted to sell it, that might have been a better opportunity to try and accomplish that, but that doesn't mean that somebody does. The one sticking point I have in this is the parking lot that's the mystery parking lot, and I would like to leverage my positive affirmation of this project with some type of discussion or suggestions on what can be done with that parking lot. I don't think cars need to park there. I don't think that's a parking lot that's appropriate that close to the creek, regardless of the improvements and the added buffer area. The fact that it's unneeded by either of the businesses that use it means that it could go away. I'm struck without a suggestion on what it could go to. But I think it certainly is an eyesore. It's certainly an environmental sore, and certainly the trash enclosure and the trash itself that's being put there is not a requirement of the property owner. It's solely for the remedy of an adjacent property, and I think they should look to move that remedy elsewhere. I run into Mr. Kelly now and then, and we say, how's the bridge project coming? And I get an earful, so I know that this has been a long, hard process, probably continuing to be a long, hard process, and I appreciate that the work that's gone into that to getting to this point, and I certainly want to support that going forward. So I think just my two suggestions would be the construction hours, and then I'd like to hear what else could be suggested or remedied to removing that use of the property adjacent to the building as a parking lot. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, could I make a comment on the parking? Commissioner Jordan mentioned that it was unnecessary parking, unneeded parking, and it's not required parking, but it is heavily used, and our coastal plan does identify a large lack of parking in the waterfront area. Just something to keep in mind.
It's actually would be more to my point of why it shouldn't be there if it's heavily used at that particular location. And I doubt that our coastal plan would allow us to plop down a new parking lot in that type of location.
Mr. Wiley.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, sorry to be up here so much, but I got to tell you, for some reason, these acquisitions like this remind me of hand surgery, and you've got to go in there and you take all this stuff apart and you got to put it all back together, and the details get real complicated. People argue about trash enclosures and they argue about parking. They care more about parking and trash than they care about money or anything else. It's my understanding that the Beach House and the Mountain Air Sports have leasehold rights to park in that triangle. They park their employees there. It works fine for them. And for us to come in now and to mess that up, frankly, means then legally we've got to go to the Beach House, just like we're dealing with Rusty's. And we can't avoid that. Now we would have to go to the Beach House, to Mountain Air Sport, and tell them, we are going to impact your lease rights. And they're going to say, you owe us some money. And we're going to, I've seen this happen, the tail will start wagging the dog. No one has complained about the employee parking in that triangle. It is what it is. They have a right to do it legally. There's no ordinance against that. For us to now try to take the parking out of there would really complicate this. So.
Fair enough. So, Mr. Johnson, I guess let me ask another question then. If that was the case, then what suggestions could be made from Creeks Division that if cars were going to be parked there in the design of that buffer area or the drainage that would improve, given the fact that the parking would stay there?
Commissioner Jordan, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is just to change the surfacing of the parking lot. You could put in something that would be permeable, and that might reduce runoff and pollution that goes directly into the lagoon from that. But as I understand it, this project isn't resurfacing that parking lot, and therefore that's a question for maybe Dan to tell us whether there's a nexus there to resurface the parking lot as part of this larger project. And if there is, that would help out. I'm just not sure if there is.
Okay, and so Mr. Gullett, if that was something I wanted to draw a line in the sand on, whether I was to support this project or not, I guess I'm back to my confusing question of whose responsibility is that for that type of improvement in this project?
If I could back up to the Cabrillo Bridge project, this area is actually included in a temporary construction easement, so there'll be staging and construction on this. And as part of that approval, there was resurfacing approved. It's considered open parking. There is striping now, but it was never approved striping. And the stormwater BMPs do include capture of the runoff of the parking lot along the creek. So I don't think I answered your question directly about who could be responsible in the context of this project, though.
But the end result would be that it is included in the construction dynamics from a stormwater management program process.
The stormwater management program requires capture, retention, and treatment of the 1-inch 24-hour storm on both this parcel and this parcel. So that's why that bioswale that I believe it's on sheet P8 in your packet, that's why that's included in the project, and that's how they meet their stormwater requirements.
Okay, I'd like to mull on that, and I'll pass it along.
Great. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with many of Mr. Jordan's comments, and I too have a concern about that parking lot. If there could at least be some land, there are some, as I recall from the site visit, there's at least one space that could have a tree planted in it. That it's not a parking space, and it's sort of leftover space. But I don't know if, but how much we can make. Can we make anything like that a condition on this project?
Commissioner, Richard Six will address that, but we already added a triangle, and then Richard can speak to adding landscaping beyond that.
Yes, Plan Commission, Commissioner Lodge, we are anticipating some shade trees in the palette and so forth in that area to soften that area. So I think it's already in the plan. I think you see a graphic of a larger tree in the middle there. That's an architect's estimation of where it would be, but we have qualified landscape architect to pick and the species and so forth. So we are anticipating better screening of landscape-wise.
Well, that will certainly help. I was thinking of a space that's over against the beach house building.
Oh, I understand.
Where the direction of the parking spaces changes, and there's a leftover space that would help. Yeah, it's right there. A tree there would make a big difference.
Any further comments?
No, it's just something that it's really not our purview, but I was thinking of the fenestration in the tower and of the courthouse tower where there's grill work over it, and that would give more of a Spanish feel to it, if that's something that might be considered by the owner of the property. Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. I remember looking at this in 2007 when the city was contemplating the bridge replacement project, and there was kind of a big empty question mark on this particular spot, and the commission at the time, and certainly I wondered, wow, what's going to happen there? Because city staff didn't have an answer at that time. It was kind of, well, we're going to work it out and just wait and see. And I you know, my imagination ran wild. Is it going to be like city comes up with a lot of money and buys the building, or is it an eminent domain battle? You know, what'll happen? And what has actually happened is a very good outcome. I have to say I admire the work that has gone on all sides to come to a project that is elegant, that makes really very little change to the uses and the familiarity of the area. The property owner is comfortable with it. Mr. Six and his crew have done a wonderful job making a very attractive building. So with only a few kind of tweaks regarding the trash enclosure and some landscaping in the parking, the triangular, the weird parking lot. I've used that parking lot when I go to Mountain Air Sports. It's a great place to go in for half an hour, do your shopping, and come back out again. I know it gets used, but it is definitely a kind of stepchild space, and it really should be brought in more to the context of the area. Let's see. I do think it's sad to lose some of the outdoor seating that was there. That was a really nice place to be, and it's been replaced kind of, sort of. In 2007, when the idea was, well, where shall it go? There were ideas that there could be balcony or that it could face out onto the new landscaped area. But when we were looking at the hotel across the street, we we kind of got the message that really populating the creek setback was the wrong way to go. And so this is the right way to go. What has been done there has been very sensitive to the area, and I appreciate that as well. So I support the project. I would like to see the trash enclosure and perhaps a better landscape plan that happens in that wedge, but the main part of the project I think is very good. And just from a personal standpoint, I actually like the lighthouse. We've had various discussions about creating new landmarks in Santa Barbara, and for better or for worse, maybe this is not the courthouse tower, but it's also not Santa Claus on Santa Claus Lane. It's a little campy, but it's there and people are familiar with it. It marks the entrance to the building, and I'm glad that you're keeping it in all of its unique glory. If you want to put grill work on it, maybe that would be good, but I'm glad you're keeping it, and I like the project.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I used to eat a lot of crab and shrimp Louis there back in the way day. And I recall fondly the discussions over the lighthouse tower when it was first constructed, and how surprised everyone was. I'm happy to support this project, although, it's kind of a what you see is what you get project because of the circumstances. But I think that Mr. Six has done a great job of kind of putting all these moving parts together in a way that really does work, and I'm very appreciative of that. Let's see. It was a difficult site, and this is one of the ones where design is problem solving, and it's been well applied. If there was a line in the sand ever drawn, it was when that building was integrated into the bridge. So we do have to remediate that situation one way or another. And I'm sensitive to the owner, but appreciative of the improvements and of the complex deal, or whatever you want to call it, that Mr. Wiley and the city and the federal government, however anybody's getting any funding these days, is like an Easter miracle. So I think it's we're lucky. So what I would ask is that when you do the tree in the little parking lot, you're sensitive to a determinate species so that it doesn't block any more important view from the across the street to the mountains, because that view, although we didn't get a real historic report, it is mentioned that view is historically significant. So it is a view corridor. So I would ask about that the tree be a species that doesn't block, and I agree with the idea in the resolution of the construction hours for Fridays of a 3-day weekend, really having it a 4-day weekend, because we do have people pouring into town. And I think that's about it. I'm glad you're not losing seats. In a perfect world, we could get a creek setback here increased, but at what cost? It's really difficult. We do have, I kind of thought of it as overhang plus setback equals, so that the negative gets counted as part of the increase. Because if you're overhanging that by X and then you're pulling it back by X, then that could be added to Y over here, and you would kind of have a feeling of an idea that, yes, we have pulled back into a setback by getting that cantilever out of there. So I'm hoping that I can have that in my conscience about it. So those are my comments. I understand the difficulties of the site, appreciate the architect and the architecture that's gone into this and the careful thought, appreciate the sensitivity of the owner because believe me, it's difficult to have any property down there, and dealing with all the agencies and trying to get something that can satisfy everyone, so that speaks to the owner as well. And the city, the government, the feds, the owner, the architect, I'm just going to say, good job. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to open my comments, really address them to the city's approach and working. The city, that is, our city attorney and public works, and working with the applicant and the property owner. I'm so pleased that our approach all along has been to have open discussion, negotiations, and collaboration, because this is, as Mr. Wiley said, a highly complex project, and the Castanolas are here and involved because of the bridge reconstruction. So I think, given that it's not an ideal situation, probably for the property owner as well as the city, I think this is a win-win, considering that. And I think a tremendous amount of really good work by both the city and the Historic Landmarks Commission. I think we had a commissioner here earlier from that that commission. They've really worked very carefully with the applicant to try to come up with a compatible and elegant design. Initially, I was skeptical of how this new Spanish-style design was going to work in conjunction with retention of the lighthouse element, but I think you've done a beautiful job, Mr. Six, in enlarging and nestling in that new entrance right up against the lighthouse. And I agree with Mr. Peugeot, or Commissioner Peugeot, that it's an architectural folly, and I think you're going to make it work. And I think it references the proximity to maritime, which we need to retain down there, to have everything look Spanish style and not have there be a relationship to the ocean, I think would be a lost opportunity on our part. So I think you've done an excellent job. In general, I would say that we have some real pluses here. I've seen from the plan and from the staff report a reduction in building and hardscape, an increase in landscape right next to the creek. So we're taking this opportunity to improve all of that. And I think overall, with the bridge renovation or reconstruction, improvements in the Mission Creek flood control, creek landscaping, and hopefully improved commercial viability also for the property, for Rusty's, even though there won't be an intensification of use. I think there's been an excellent job all around done in trying to optimize with as great sensitivity as possible to the environmental factors. I fully lend my support to the approval of this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, likewise, I agree with many of my commissioners. You know, after having reviewed the bridge project in 2007, it's great to actually see it back before us with a chance of actually being implemented, you know, within our lifetimes here before something does happen with that bridge. So, again, I compliment the architect, I think, for only dealing with one corner of the building, totally transforming the image of that sort of beachfront intersection. And I think it's really going to be an improvement to that area. At first I was concerned about maybe some of the loss of mountain views, but even from the sidewalk across the street, the one-story building with its parapets and mechanical equipment do that already. So I think this is really going to celebrate Mission Creek, and hopefully if the bridge flows better, you know, we won't have some of the trapped debris and some of the other things that have happened in the past. So I do think it is a win-win situation. And I think Commissioner Larson really hit it on the head in terms of the creek setback. When you're starting from a negative 22-foot encroachment and ending up with a full 8-foot setback, it's a 30-foot difference that we're getting without, you know, really having to sacrifice the use of the property. So I think, you know, the owner of the property is going to end up with a nicer property that really celebrates that creek situation and orients its building toward the waterfront. So I think it's a gain for them, and it's certainly a better creek experience, and actually continuing that full landscape all the way to Cabrillo rather than being interrupted by the building now is, I think, a really good situation. And the fact that the existing condition is legal, I think we need to recognize that as being our baseline in terms of the improvements that we're making. So I know there's been discussion on the adjacent triangular parking lot. It's really not the subject parcel, I think, to this application, and I actually appreciate the fact that, you know, what is there is being removed. Yes, we would all like to do more, but I don't think it's fair to link it to this bridge replacement project, and I'm, you know, happy that at least the surfaces will be improved with some amount of stormwater management put in place and the trash enclosure so that we're not looking at that from the beachfront. I do look forward someday to the Helena Avenue side, those street improvements being completed, but I understand that's really not part of this project, but we need to go at it parcel by parcel, and I think there's a momentum in that area. I look forward to that actually being completed. So I think this project will hopefully set a good precedent and really keep that momentum going. So I would happily support it, and I would look forward to a motion from the Commission.
I'll try and make a motion. Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to approve the project, making the findings contained in Section A of the staff report as follows. Approve the front setback modification on East Cabrillo Boulevard, the front setback modification on Helena Avenue, and approve the coastal development permit. I would respectfully ask that we include in the resolution to include Fridays on the construction hours, to include Fridays on weekends that have a Monday holiday, and I think that's it. So I respectfully submit my motion.
Do I have a second for that?
Second.
Ms. Jacobs, any further discussion items on that? Okay, I call the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. You have a project appealable within 10 days, hopefully not. Thank you very much for all the hard work and explanation, too. I think we'll take about just a 5-minute break to let Commissioner Jostes reappear and let the next applicant set up. All right, having a quorum, I would like to reopen the September 2nd meeting of the Planning Commission. We're on to item 3B, which is the application for 3626 San Remo Drive. And Dan Gullett will be doing our staff presentation.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, this is a 4-lot subdivision at 3626 San Remo Drive. The project includes preservation of a historic facade of the existing residence, demolition of all other existing structures, including the driveway, addition of a new driveway. The subdivision includes development envelopes for each of the 4 proposed lots, drainage improvements, and creek restoration. The project site is located west of the corner of North Ontario and San Remo Drive. You can see the outline of the existing residence, and there's a garage with an apartment building or an apartment unit above toward the back of the lot. This lot is bounded on the east side by San Roque Creek. And this is an aerial photograph of the project site. This is the historic house in San Roque Creek. The applications you're considering today are for 3 public street frontage waivers and 3 street frontage modifications. Those are for the back 3 parcels and a tentative subdivision map. A historic structures report was reviewed and approved by the Historic Landmarks Commission. That report concluded that portions of the existing residence is eligible for a structure of merit. Those elements are the architecture and because of the street presence of that structure. So the project retains the south facade of that structure, the curved staircase, and the east elevation entrance. Also, a view corridor is provided from San Remo Drive, and historic documentation to city standards would be provided as well. This is the proposed configuration of the subdivision. The lots range in size between 14,000 and 16,500 square feet. The driveway is proposed on the western property line, and this is the existing residence, and this is the facade that would be preserved. And you can see the cone of the view easement from San Remo below. The street frontage modifications and waivers are supported by staff because adequate access is provided for ingress and egress to each of the lots and for fire suppression purposes. With the conditions, there's also adequate provision for maintenance of the driveway. And at this location, a public street isn't desirable because there isn't a connection through that's possible. The driveway would be narrower than a public street at this location, so it would have less impact to the creek and the trees. And if it were to be a public street, the city would have to maintain it. The Single Family Design Board reviewed the subdivision grading plan conceptually in July, and 3 of the comments made by the Single Family Design Board included a desire to limit the tree removals to at the time of construction and to relocate the utility easement. It is proposed right on the western property line, and Single Family Design Board wanted it to be relocated underneath the driveway to provide for more landscaping opportunity along that western property line. So the proposed conditions address both of these issues raised by the Single Family Design Board. The condition would require tree removals to be approved by the SFDB either through the subdivision grading plan or through the development of each of the individual lots. The SFDB also indicated that they were supportive of the proposed creek setback of 35 feet. So the portion of the existing house that's historically significant is at its closest point is about 35 feet from the top of bank. The applicant is proposing development envelopes for all 4 lots to match that and be 35 feet from the top of bank. And staff is recommending a larger setback where possible. It's not possible at the location of the historic building, but it would be on the other lots and the remainder of that lot. And I'll go back and show where the 35-foot setback is. So the 35-foot line essentially extends up here. This is where it meets the historic building, and then all the way up through parcel 1. To give some context of the major drainages in the city, this is San Roque Creek. The stars where approximately the project's located. San Roque Creek's a tributary to Arroyo Burro, which drains to the channel at Arroyo Burro Beach. And this is a closer view, the State Street below, and then Foothill Road above. And this shows the footprints of the buildings between Foothill and San Remo. This is Stevens Park. So you can see up along Stevens Park, houses are pretty well set back from the creek. Some of these other subdivisions between Stevens Park and the subject property have houses that are closer here and here. And the development immediately across the creek has larger creek setbacks. And again, this is about 35 feet at this location. So the basis of staff's recommendation for the larger setback is outlined in the staff report. It includes general plan guidance and policies and the open space element and conservation element and the land use map with the buffer overlay. Also, the location and quality of the creek frontage at this location. It's a very natural reach of the creek at this location. and precedent of applying creek setbacks to subdivisions on a case-by-case basis. The increased creek setback would provide improved water quality, improved riparian plant and wildlife habitat, protection against debris flows and flooding over a 35-foot setback, and also an enhanced view shed along the creek. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission approve the project with reconfigured development envelopes to provide a 50-foot setback where possible, subject to the conditions in Exhibit A, making the findings in Section 6 of the staff report. And that concludes staff's presentation.
Great, thank you very much. With that, I will go to the applicant for their presentation.
Chair Bartlett, Planning Commissioners, good afternoon. My name is Nancy Madsen. I'm one of the owners of the property, along with my brother Robert Madsen. We're the applicant. And just wanted you to know that about 30 years ago now, my parents and grandparents negotiated to purchase this property, and it's been used in our family with great joy and appreciation for all these years. There's actually 5 generations of Madsens who've been using that property, two generations above us and 2 below. And we care very much about the beauty and integrity of this particular project. And in that way, we are pleased to maintain this particular facade that you can sort of see on that slide. It's not the brightest slide, but we will be preserving that and maintaining it. And this is the house that I propose to live in myself. And we are also offering to completely restore the creek side to its natural riparian habitat, which is not the case now. We will be removing all non-natives and replanting with everything that is appropriate for the creek. And we have a development plan for the creek that should be in your packet somewhere. So for you to know that the subdivision of this property is actually the only way financially, practically, that we can keep the property in the family to some extent and also divide the estate, since this is the only asset of the estate and there are debts we need to pay. So this is the way we can keep it in the family. And we appreciate your consideration. And Pegert Group Architects have done a great job planning, and they're going to present now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming in.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Dan's done a fine job of summarizing the project and showing you the location of the property, and I'm just going to go through some of our slides and give you our perspective on the proposal. This actually shows as you went out to the site, I know, and were able to see the location of the existing house, the garage with the apartment. There's a shed here, shows the existing top of bank here, and then the driveway that's along the existing bank. So the site information is that it's about 1.5 acres, and it's got the single-family use with the detached structures. The zoning allows for 7 units on the property, but given the configuration and the desired design by the applicant, they sought only 4 additional units. And the slope, because of some of the aspects of the creek, is about 11%, but it gently slopes to the south. So sorry these photos are so dark. We're not certain why this happens, but I know you've been to the site. This just gives you an idea of the views up. This is up the driveway. This is actually the redwood tree that currently projects into the right-of-way that we worked out a solution with Public Works and Transportation staff to save, which is really a great thing from the applicant's perspective. And you can sort of see it right in here. This just gives you some photographs of the house. The front is quite lovely, but if you start poking around inside the house and you look in the back, it's been added on to in unusual ways over the period of time, which is why they're preserving the front facade and then demolishing the rest of the house to improve it. I'm sorry, you can't really make those out. That was the garage. And then this is just the project vicinity. So as Dan indicated, it's a tentative parcel map with 4 parcels. The building envelopes on the lots range from about 3,200 square feet up to about 5,300 square feet. There's going to be 2 covered parking spaces for each lot and a guest space because we know that there is maybe some challenge parking along San Remo. We also indicated we're preserving the facade. We've got the view easement being provided. The applicant volunteered to do the restoration and actually planned it a number of years ago. So the original report was probably written about 7 years ago. She's proposing a 35-foot setback, and we sort of debated back and forth about what the setback ought to be on that property when we were trying to figure out how the lots will be configured, and had talked about a 25-foot setback given sort of the urban nature of the area, and I'll show you how the development is currently set back along that creek later in the slideshow, but ended up working with staff and deciding that 35 feet was probably the right setback in that particular neighborhood. And then, of course, the preservation of the redwood tree, which I've mentioned. We're preserving 31 trees on the site, and you probably noticed that it was pretty heavily wooded, and removing 13. We did everything we possibly could to protect as many oaks as possible, but there are so many of them that we ended up having to remove 6 of them. And then we're taking out the non-natives, which are 5 palms, an avocado, and a pittosporum. The project includes the stormwater best management practices. One of the elements is that within the building envelope, there's another restriction, and that is to minimize impervious surfaces to 2,950 square feet. So that means the building footprint as well as any impervious patios that one might pour. We've also incorporated a permeable driveway, so that'll be pavers. And then there are bioswales on 3 of the lots that clean the water as it travels to the east and then ultimately down to the street and enters a storm drain. And it turns out that actually with the development of the site and the improvements that are going to be made, we reduce stormwater that leaves the site during a 25-year storm. So here's the subdivision map that shows the layout of the lots. And there's the building envelopes as they're currently configured. This shows the additional constraints of the 2,950 square foot impervious surface limitation. That gives you an idea of where the view easement is. That's from San Remo. And the idea is to preserve sort of this sloping landscaped area and then the facade of the building. Then we show the 35-foot setback that's proposed in the green line here, and then the proposed location of the driveway. And this was also something we spent a good deal of time talking about. Do you move the existing driveway over? What's the best idea? And certainly we saw a lot of merit in moving the driveway over to the west because that allows you to do the restoration work along the creek. But also what it allowed for was the creation of a buffer between these neighbors that are directly adjacent to the property and the future residential uses that would be on this site. So this is just the preliminary grading and drainage plan, which we can come back to if you have any questions about some of the drainage improvements. So historic preservation, as Dan mentioned, we went to the HLC and there was a lot of interest in preserving the Edwards Plunkett design, which we've done. And then, of course, at the Single Family Design Review Board, there was a discussion about the lot orientation as well as the creek setback. And I think there was, while I didn't attend and Mr. Pikert did, there was a fair amount of discussion about the adequacy of that setback, and they felt that given the environment that the project was in, the surrounding development and the setbacks that are in that area, as well as the applicant's decision and proposal to restore the creek, that they felt the 35-foot setback was sufficient. And then they also asked us to preserve trees until construction was started, and I don't think the applicant has a problem with that. So this doesn't really give you the view I'd hoped, but this is an actual view up the driveway looking at the existing facade. And this, if you could see, is a little planted area down here and shows the future house up there. So this is a graphic that's been generated from a model. So that's the view that's be planned, and there's constraints about what can occur in this particular area with respect to plantings and any walls or fences that might be built. They have to, I think it's 42 feet is what has to be observed. So with creek restoration mitigation, as I indicated, the applicant's proposing a 35-foot setback, removing the existing development that's within that 35-foot setback. which includes the existing driveway and the garage and the apartment unit. And then the restoration plan was prepared by Althouse and Mead. They do a fair amount of work, and we've worked with them. In fact, on the Hillside House, we worked with them. And they're going to be restoring the areas of the previous development, so all along the top of the bank there, and I have a graphic that will show you. And part of that will be removing all the non-natives and then planting natives. So this shows you the area of restoration, which is fairly significant. The oaks that are going to be removed are being replanted on a 3-to-1 ratio, and they'll be planted in the restoration area. Where feasible, we're going to be taking seedlings and saplings from the site to replant in the restoration area, because it's better to use plants that have actually grown naturally on a site rather than bring in seedlings or saplings from out of the area. As I said, they'll be removing the non-natives and planting this native understory in the area. So creek setback. So here are some of the this is the basis for why the applicant felt it was sufficient to provide a 35-foot setback. First, it's increasing the existing setback that is on the property, because you have development, you have the driveway right on the top of the bank, and then you have the garage and the apartment unit encroaching into that setback. It actually is greater than most of the setbacks in that neighborhood. She's providing a restoration of the creek area, including the top of the bank and then down into the creek in the southern area. The setback does not result in any biological impacts. In fact, when the study that we prepared was actually completed, the concept was a 25-foot setback, and that report indicated that even with a 25-foot setback, you would not have any significant biological impacts. The 35-foot setbacks consistent with many of the setbacks that have been approved by the Planning Commission in the recent past, which I'll have a graph for you. It was supported by the Single Family Design Review Board, and there really aren't any specific requirements. And I know that Dan referenced guidance in the general plan, but there isn't anything in the code, and there isn't anything in the general plan that identifies a specific setback for this creek. The only guidance you really have is along Mission Creek. And I think that's probably something you're going to want to resolve in your general plan as you're working towards solutions for things that you don't currently have. But I think it would be important. It'll be important as we move into the future, I think, to kind of give better guidance on what these setbacks can be, so people have more knowledge of what's going to be applying to a property. So this shows you the 35-foot setback, which is in green in this particular area, and then what a 50-foot setback would look like. So you can see how the setbacks relate to existing development in the neighborhood. And then here's a table of some of the most recently approved projects that the Planning Commission's reviewed. And the setbacks here, not all along Mission Creek, but many of them are. And they range between 25 feet and 41 feet. So a proposal of 35 feet probably is on the higher end of what you've been reviewing and approving in the last, so probably, I don't know, a year and a half or so, 2 years. So in staff's, in their report, they make a recommendation for 50 feet, and they have several points that they use as to support that recommendation, and that's one thing we wanted to talk about. We want to talk about each point that they make and how that relates to this particular property and this particular proposal. So one question we have about it is, does the project create water quality impacts? Because that's one of the points they make, that it would improve it. And actually, as I mentioned, through the best management practices that are going to be used as part of the stormwater management, the project actually reduces runoff in the area. So runoff that leaves the site now is greater than it will be once this project is built. All the runoff that is going to be leaving the site will be cleaned, which isn't the case today. And then no direct runoff will enter the creek. So we don't there aren't any water quality impacts associated with the project that would necessitate an increased setback to mitigate those impacts. Is the site subject to flooding? Because they indicated that the additional 15 feet would further protect the project and future residences against flooding, but the site's not in a flood hazard area, and in probably the last 30 years it hasn't flooded. And in 1993, when we had our 500-year storm, the water never breached the bank, or nor did it come close in that particular area. And I know that Public Works has made some improvements with respect to catching debris to minimize any flooding that might ever occur in the future, but the bank is pretty high in this particular area. So does the project significantly impact habitat? And as I indicated, we have a biological report that says it does not. It expands and improves the riparian habitat through the restoration effort that the Madsens are planning to carry out. And then does the project have a significant impact on the view shed of the creek? You know, I think there's some views of the creek as you walk along the sidewalk there from San Remo, and I think through the subdivision and the requirement for the view corridor easement, if you will, it's preserving some views of that creek, and I think the restoration efforts were actually going to improve that view. So there is an impact associated with asking for an increased setback, and that's something we just want to spend a little bit of time talking about. Probably the most constrained lot is Lot 4, which is the lot right along the street. And as you can see, it's constrained by a front yard setback, the goal of preserving these two oaks that are on the property right there, and then also the view corridor. So it's already a fairly constrained lot as it is. It would reduces the buildable areas of lots 1 and 2, which I'll show on a graphic subsequent to this. It then also causes us to sort of move the development closer to the west. And one of our goals was obviously to find a balance between creating this buffer on the west as well as creating an adequate creek setback. And through the design and the discussions, I think we felt that we had achieved that balance. And then the other impact that I think is important to think about is that the smaller we make that building envelope, the more constrained we are with respect to how we modulate the mass. The idea is to have an envelope that's large enough so that you can have the footprint a large enough size and have the second story be a little bit smaller. So the smaller we make that available footprint, the more mass you might see on the second story.
You're over 16 minutes at this point.
I'm getting close. So this just gives you an idea of what the additional constraint would be. It shows you this dashed line is the 50 feet. One thing I wanted to note is I know that at the site visit, which I unfortunately missed, there was some discussion about Lot 1 and its size, and I think we probably should have shown that there is going to be a driveway and a turnaround area that's going to be on that lot, which actually shown here creates a smaller buildable area than one might actually first think. And then actually if the 50-foot setback were applied to Lot 4, it actually would make that buildable lot envelope area smaller than the impervious surfaces limitation that currently is applied to that. So you can see the changes in the buildable envelopes from now to a 50-foot setback. So in conclusion, we think the project, that we've worked hard to design a subdivision that both respects the creek and respects the neighborhood, and believe that the efforts to restore San Roque Creek will be really beneficial to the area and the neighbors. It increases the setback on the site. We think it will enhance the neighborhood, and we know that right along San Remo there's varying types of development, and I think this subdivision will fit in nicely with some of the existing single-family development there. It's going to provide a few new housing opportunities, which I think are always appreciated in Santa Barbara. And then, as it's required, it's going to be contributing, obviously, to the Inclusionary Housing Fund, which will hopefully then be going towards building some more very low-income housing. So this just concludes our presentation with what we're asking from the Planning Commission is to approve the subdivision and approve it with the proposed 35-foot setback, as well as the lot front modifications and the frontage waiver. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them, or present any of the additional slides.
Great. Thank you for being very thorough as well. Mr. Cotto, do we have speaker slips? Okay, I will open public comment. It looks like we have two speakers. First will be Eddie Harris, followed by Christian Bizarre. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but
Good afternoon again, Mr. Chair and members of the Planning Commission. I'm Eddie Harris, President of the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council. And I visited the site, took a good look around there, and noted the impacts that are presently located too close to the creek, and noted the presence of canopy trees, native trees. There is a good potential there for recovery along the creek. There's the creek itself is Esha, but there's an excellent potential there for to expand that and enlarge it and make it a very valuable natural presence alongside the creek there, which is a very important part of the natural environment in this watershed. I think that the staff recommendations for this project are definitely, in this case, a step in the right direction. We agree with City Creek's division that a 50-foot buffer there is appropriate for this location, and we agree with the other recommendations that they've made. The restoration plan is comprehensive, and we like the depth and the detail that has been proposed to ensure the success of revegetation and creekside recovery. And I want to talk a little bit about CEQA. The California Environmental Quality Act provides a very useful framework for evaluation of proposals such as this one. It's a valuable tool that would ensure that the most beneficial alternative would be selected. It also allows for analysis of competing community objectives, such as you have here with the presence of an historic facade and the creek. And I don't understand why CEQA isn't used in cases like this to ensure that the best outcome for the creek resources and other important community values. I think it would be a very helpful and very good tool to use. Again, we agree with City Creek's division that a 50-foot buffer is appropriate, and we urge that you locate the buildable envelopes as far as possible from the creek at a minimum of 50 feet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we do have your letter as well. So.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Christian Pizarro.
Good afternoon, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Christina Pizarro, and I'm actually here today before you because I actually lived on Ontario Road for many, many years, and I'm quite familiar with the property and the project that is proposed. I used to walk my dog there many, many times, and so I'm in absolute favor of the project. I'm comfortable with the creek setback at 35 feet. And more importantly, I'm excited about the creek restoration, and I think that will revitalize the creek. I think it will regenerate that creek habitat that is in need. The creek has been in disarray for many, many years, and so I've seen it just in disrepair. I've seen graffiti there. I've seen so many horrible things. I've even jumped in the creek here and there throughout the years to remove trash and debris and things like that. So I really feel that this creek restoration is vital. I think it would enhance the community and the neighborhood there. And I also feel that the new housing will really, really be a positive asset to that neighborhood. I think we need new housing. I think it'll provide something that's great, and it will enhance the neighborhood greatly. So thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, I'll close public comment, bring it back to the commission for questions, and I think I'll start again with Ms. Schwartz on my left, or my right, your left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with creek setback. Ms. Plowman, if I could ask you to come back up, please. Staff has recommended 50. I see that the Single Family Design Board has recommended, or I should say is comfortable with your 35. Could you comment on the 35 to 50 and beyond what you've already expressed to us, any concerns that your client might have in moving towards 50 from 35?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schwartz, I think her main concern is, first of all, I think she believes that the 35-foot setback is going to accomplish many of the things that the city staff wants to, and it's going to be an improvement in the area. But she is concerned about really constraining those building envelopes and wanting them to be of a size where it creates some flexibility about how you place the house and where you place it and how close it is either to the west side or even to the creek setback. I mean, I'm guessing that future owners are going to want to orient their homes, taking an advantage of that beautiful setback area and maybe even having a patio out there. So their hope is to maintain as much flexibility as possible. And she's really concerned about, in particular, Lot 4 and the constraints, pretty extreme constraints that a 50-foot setback puts on that particular lot. And I think there's one thing I know that had come up. I'm not sure which commissioner raised the question, or maybe staff had suggested about changing lot lines, but part of the historic preservation of the facade on Lot 3 is sort of creating this landscape, or preserving this landscape mound that sort of rises up as you see the facade. So when you start shifting lot lines and pushing development and making the building envelope for Lot 4 larger, you start impacting that preservation of that view. So that's one of the reasons why 50-foot setback seems to be onerous in this particular case.
Could you put back up for me your view corridor slide? This is to my next question about the view shed of the historic facade of the Edwards and Plunkett designed house.
There you go. I'll just give you everything. Is that the slide you were looking for?
No, it actually is. I think it's entitled View Corridor. At the bottom, you have a current view from San Remo of the home up the current driveway, and then a contrasting or comparing one, to the right.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, if the driveway is being relocated to what I'll call the left of the property, the left of the homes, the structures that will be developed there, how will we have that view shed? Is it just, maybe I can't see because it's a dark slide, is it just shifted left up onto the property from the new driveway? Is that just the difference in the angle? It almost looks like it's the same view shed. I'm not sure how we could get that.
No, it is the same.
A closed off driveway.
This is going to be all replanted with understory. And so you won't have any planting. This shows actually, if I could show you the slide with better lighting, this shows a replanting of vegetation along here. So that area is going to be preserved for a view. So we can't plant any hedges in that area that exceed a certain height. So they'll won't be any taller than that. And so the idea is to preserve that view as you sort of see this green lawn. And I'm not sure that it'll remain lawn, probably not, but sort of this landscape mound as you rises up to meet the existing facade. And then actually, if you could see this, you could see that the model includes the home on this particular property, and you can see how the view is sheltered, so you don't get a glimpse of that house. It's sort of hidden behind vegetation so that you maintain that view of that particular facade.
Okay, so no actual ingress onto the property with your new design. It's sort of a peekaboo view of the reconstructed facade or newly placed facade.
That's correct.
Historic facade. Okay.
That's correct.
And then I'd like to ask you from your letter to Paul Casey about the arborist report. And what you plan to do with the trees here. Now, we saw in our site visit how, I think it's the redwood. The redwood is already broken through that low retaining wall on San Remo. and I see that there's a certain proposal to kind of shift things around with the street, the wall, and so forth. The proposal seems to be predicated on some assumptions about what goes on with parking on San Remo, right in that area right now. Have you, or perhaps Dan, has the city studied who makes use of that parking right in front of the property currently?
That's an excellent question, and you know what? I think Nancy is probably the best person to answer that question. But the times that I've been out there, there hasn't been anybody parking on San Remo in that particular area. But we did get some feedback from neighbors saying that they felt that people from I believe it was from the apartment units were parking along San Remo in that area. But I just haven't seen any. Yeah, why don't you come up, Nancy?
Thank you. Well, since 1981, when my parents and grandparents moved in, there's usually maybe one, usually no cars along San Remo, although there is a gentleman who walks up the creek to paint, and his truck is sometimes there. But generally, there's not a lot of parking there. And if I understand the plan, when we close off the driveway, that will become parking, and when we bump out the curb to save the beautiful redwood, well, I think we're going to trade off a space for a space, but the neighbors on Adair, which are the ones that back up to the property in question, they were telling me when I spoke with them about this that people from apartment buildings across San Remo were beginning to park on their little cul-de-sac. That was their parking concern, and I told them we'll have guest parking for our guests, so we won't be impacting them. Does that help?
So, Mr. Gullett, is Ms. Mattson correct, and perhaps I just didn't see that in our packet, that it's kind of a wash, removing a parking space from the current ingress from the driveway, removing that but putting one back in elsewhere on that area of San Remo?
Mr. Chair, that's something Transportation Operations would eventually look at when the subdivision right-of-way improvements come through city review.
Okay.
But it appears to be a wash to me.
Okay.
And that's part of the reason why the applicant provided guest parking on their site, even though they're not required to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And this graphic is now, we've changed machines, so now you can better see. If we dim the lights, you can get a look at that. So there you can actually see sort of a shadow of a proposed structure that would be on Lot 4. Any other questions?
No, but could you keep this slide handy for later during my comments? Thank you.
Ms. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want the applicant and the owner to know I did visit the site with staff and Ms. Madsen, so we walked it, and although I wasn't present at the site visit with the group, I couldn't be there, I did visit and do the whole walk. So I'm very comfortable with any comments I have to make. And I really don't have a lot of questions. It's pretty self-explanatory. I have a small one to staff. This didn't percolate up to the level of like a historic structures report, or has there been significant alterations so that is it on what's the status on the Edwards Plunkett House?
So Historic Structures Report was reviewed and approved by Historic Landmarks Commission, and that's what found those facades to be to qualify as potential structure of merit.
And we didn't get that, did we? Please tell me we didn't, because I didn't get one. Okay.
It wasn't in the packet. I do have it with me if you'd like to take a look.
I wish I'd had it before so I could have read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Larson. Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These are probably questions for I'll start with questions for Ms. Plowman. I don't mean to make you get up and down here. I see you had a run-in with a curb somewhere.
This is a rock.
Let me start with the 2950 number as far as impervious surfaces. Where does that come from? Is that a requirement, a self-imposed guideline? enlighten me on that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Joseph, that actually came out of the stormwater study that was done by our engineers and working with city staff, that the way the regulations are written or the guidelines are written now, you can't increase your stormwater leaving the site from a 25-year storm, but there's also a requirement about a 24 1-inch storm. And so while the project reduced the water stormwater runoff leaving the site during a 25-year storm, the requirement required a further reduction in stormwater leaving the site, and that's where we ended up deciding to reduce and minimizing to ensure that there would be the appropriate level of permeable versus impermeable surfaces on the site to make sure we met that
I see.
requirement.
And in that study, is it fair to assume that there is some runoff that comes from the north and from the west across the site going into the creek? So there is some additional, not that it's your runoff, but it's the creek's runoff that cross the site.
The stuff that comes, the water that comes from the north, directly from the north, will still be allowed to come across a portion of the site, and then some of that will get funneled down the edge of that driveway.
I see. And on the driveway, I noted in your biological report that you said nothing was going to be, the work under the oak drip lines was limited to 1 ton or less equipment or hand
tools.
hand digging. And there's 4 water lines that are going to go right up from the street. I was curious how you're going to be ultimately bringing construction materials onto lots 1, 2, and 3 without exceeding that 1 ton limit, or are you going to do all the grading of that roadway with like a small skip loader? I just don't understand that.
Yeah, I think we'll have to talk with the engineers about how they propose to do that, but it's possible that you may end up leaving the existing driveway in place for some of the grading work that has to be done north of this area. But you're right, it's tricky.
Okay, because I'm concerned about that corner in the oak trees and just the demarcation that's set up by your drip line envelope.
Right,
Okay,
right. No, it's definitely tight right in there. I mean, we didn't want to remove them, but it does create constraints when you're talking about how you're going to grade and how you're going to put in your improvements.
Okay. The next question goes to this 7 or 8 units allowed by zoning. I can see if if this were a flat piece of land.
Oh, right.
Because you would never get 5 or 6 lots on this property. So I'm just curious as to how we use that as the starting point for looking at density here.
Sure. I think when I said in my presentation that the code allows for that, but because of the way the lot's configured and the fact that you've got a creek running through it constrains it, but you can get 5 lots on there. We did. And we designed it with 5 lots originally, but then I think in working with the Madsons, they felt, you know what, it just felt too tight. And so she came in with a reduced subdivision request.
Okay. I think that's it for my questions for Ms. Plowman. A couple questions for staff. I noted that there was a suggestion from the Single-Family Design Board that the orange trees should be saved, and I'm curious as to do you have any sense of why they would say that in the bigger picture of this particular project with a restoration plan and everything else historically going on?
Yes, at that Single-Family Design Board hearing, the neighbor adjacent to the north brought up the possibility that those citrus trees could potentially be historically significant. And there's a brief write-up in the staff report about that. I reviewed that possibility with the city's urban historian who reviewed old aerial photographs of the site, and this was all citrus groves at one point and orchards. But the city's urban historian concluded that those trees that are on site wouldn't qualify as historically significant. But and that information wasn't available to the Single Family Design Board, but it was included in their motion that that one of the members at least wanted those citrus trees to be saved.
Okay. Do you happen to know if this is a remainder parcel from a previous development, or was this just different property separate from the old San Roque subdivision that probably happened? Mr. Bartlett knows better than I, in the 40s or 50s. And if that's the side I want to look at. Yeah.
From what I saw, it appeared that this property was contiguous all the way up to Grove. San Remo used to actually be Grove Avenue, and it curved up to the north. So this was all one piece of property at one time, and then these subdivisions did cut that off. So it appears that this was a remainder from those previous subdivisions.
Well, if it's been in the Madsen family for so long, it would make sense that it would stay in the state it is up until this point. Let's see. I think that's it. I'll come back if I have more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jostes. Ms. Jacobs, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. I don't really have any questions at this point, except that given the Edwards and Plunkett house and the proximity to the creek, I would have expected a mitigated negative declaration, and I'm surprised that there isn't one, but I'm sure staff has their reasons for not pursuing that environmental review.
In terms of historic impacts, the applicant incorporated all of the recommendations from their historian prior to that report being accepted by HLC. So their project reflects what the historian's assessment is. So their project description includes the preservation of those areas. So the historic structures report concludes that it's a class 3 impact, and it's not actually mitigation, but actually part of the project, that those things are preserved.
Okay, I'll talk later in comments. Thanks.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
If I can address that question as well.
Benson.
As the Commission is familiar, there are 3 levels of environmental review. The lowest is a categorical exemption. It's a statutory development of, actually it's not statutory, it's regulatory, development of a series of categories, a series of types of development that are generally considered to be less than significant and therefore not subject to either a mitigated negative declaration or an environmental impact report. There are exceptions to the application of a categorical exemption. I want to just refer the Commission to the phrase that says that these classes are considered to apply in all instances. This is a description of the categorical exemptions as well as the exceptions, except where the project may impact on an environmental resource of hazardous or critical concern, where designated, precisely mapped, and officially adopted pursuant to law by federal, state, or local agencies. And so this particular site in particular, but in general, the city hasn't specifically identified if these resources, the creek itself, while it is a natural resource, has not been specifically identified in this particular stretch, or actually I believe any stretch of this tributary, as a critical concern. And so that's why when staff was evaluating whether or not a categorical exemption applied in this case, why we didn't get to that exception.
One discussion I do remember about the creeks in this area, because you're right, they haven't really been specifically pointed out or made into a policy statement, but during the Upper State Street guideline discussions, they were sort of called the green fingers up into the neighborhood, and there was discussion about trying to maintain an awareness of the creeks in the Upper State Street area. And this one was on there, but it was on there as it crosses State Street and becomes a public access area. And this is on private property, so it's a little bit different, but it is part of the same creek. And so for that reason, its restoration is especially valuable, and any kind of awareness or aspect of it that the public can, by passing through this area, which is a scenic highway, feel like, oh, there's a creek. To be just aware of how the creek life happens coming down the hills and into and through our area and into bigger creeks and so on. I would hope to comment on that later, just in terms of why the creek is important in its larger context and not just in this particular piece of property. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. Ms. Plowman showed a slide. You don't need to get up. Showed a slide that indicated the 50-foot setback and the 35-foot setbacks. And it appears that that slide indicated the houses fronting on Ontaire all have significantly more than 50-foot setbacks. That is at least the ones above San Remo. And staff has said that their recommendation is that it should be a 50-foot setback where possible. How are you defining where possible?
Where it doesn't interfere with the historic structure.
Okay, so everywhere else. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Jordan, this
Thank you,
is
Mr.
right
Chair.
up your creek.
So, Ms. Plowman, I'll make you stagger up there again. Let me handpick these out so I just get you up there once. I'm looking at the grading plan, but any of the other ones will do that work for this question. And so I'm confused by the photos and the projections you're showing on what the view would look like from San Remo looking up at the historical house. Mm-hmm. Because on the map, anyhow, directly adjacent to that view shed that's a darkened line, there's a 10-foot path that runs all the way down to San Remo and ends at the wall or ends at the sidewalk. And
you mean the easement that they're offering? There's a 4-foot.
At 4 feet?
The easement's 10 feet, but there's going to be a 4-foot DG path that will weave through there to provide a pedestrian.
And by the time it gets down to the sidewalk, it pretty much.
Are you looking at that? Are you looking at this dash?
There you go. Yep.
That
Mine
is a
looks better
berm.
than yours.
That's not a path.
Okay, that isn't?
That
Okay.
is a berm to prevent runoff from going over the bank.
But where's the path in relationship to that?
The path is going to be over in this area.
All right.
Little DG
Well,
path.
that solves that problem then. And when I'm standing on the sidewalk looking up that view shed,
Mm-hmm.
what am I looking at right in front of me at the sidewalk level? Is it a
There'll be-
continuation of the block wall?
There'll probably be a wall that encloses the property, I would imagine, because the property owners, but it has to be a certain level, a certain height so that you can see over it essentially. And then what you're going to see is native understory plantings that would survive nicely under sycamores or oaks or whatnot. And that's where the existing driveway is. That's all going to eventually be ripped up and replanted with that vegetation.
Then the mitigation monitoring and reporting plan that could be 5 years, could actually be longer than 5 years if some goals aren't met. What's the dynamics for, if this is 4 parcels and they're individual parcels, what's the dynamics for ensuring that actually is funded 5 or 8 or 9 years or whatever it would take?
Sure. I think that is going to have to be addressed in the CC&Rs that are developed for this little subdivision, and that the mitigation and monitoring will end up being funded by some kind of little homeowners association that they're going to have to form. or something of that nature, an agreement between the property owners, because there's going to be the path, obviously, that all of them will be responsible for maintaining. There's a driveway that they're all responsible for maintaining. So some kind of, whether it ends up being the applicant putting funding in some association bank account, or whether it's those property owners that fund that, it will have, I mean, it's a condition that's got to be met, and there'll be a way to set up for that in a financial manner.
Okay.
But I think being part of some kind of organization for the homeowners was probably the most appropriate.
Okay. And then you had one other slide that showed 35-foot setbacks, 50-foot setbacks, square footage of both envelopes. I flew by that quicker than I could make some notes, because I'd like to make some notes.
It's not happy. You want to select it up there? Oh, he's already got it open. He's got it open. Right here, Dan? You've got it open right there.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh. We can always go back to ours. We can go back to ours.
Now, you actually had like a chart that showed that showed square footage with envelopes with 35 as you're proposing, and what it would actually do to them if you increase the setback to 50, the buffer to 50. Okay, if you'll bear with me, just my rest of the questions are for staff. I'll let you sit back down.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. And Mr. Gullett, if you'll just give me a second.
One thing I thought might be useful to talk a little bit about is, I know that Commissioner Lodge brought up the properties that are directly to the east of this project, and that how those developments or the houses have been developed on those lots. And I think it's important to note those lots are about 18,000 square feet in size, and they have access off Ontaire. So they don't actually have to provide any kind of driveway through their property to create access, which then limits building area. So it makes sense for them to sort of be, to address the street, which gives them that greater setback. And this site is more constrained than that.
Thanks. Mr. Gullett, sometime I read that one of the goals when you're setting driveways up is you're not running those driveways into other residences with their lighting. And it seems to me in the location of this driveway is pointing right at a residence on the other side of San Remo. Was that discussed, not discussed, or is it acceptable?
It wasn't discussed, and that would be something that Single Family Design Board would normally weigh in on if it was raised to them or they thought it was an issue. I know the reason that the driveway is located where it is and that it's being relocated is to provide for a left turn out of the property, because there's that median island currently with a large sycamore, where currently you could only make a right onto San Remo if you're leaving the property. So this would allow exiters to make a left onto San Remo.
Okay. And then on my same question on the part of the conditions that just puts the condition there on the mitigation and the restoration and the reporting plan that will go on for at least half a decade, if not longer, what's the city's answer for how to ensure that four landowners remain financially viable to meet that condition?
So the proposed conditions include required private CC&Rs, and in condition 10A, there's a provision for common area maintenance, which requires that that the owners maintain the common areas, including landscaping, and we could be more explicit about that conservation area and seeing through the MMRP in that condition.
I guess so, but the specific question I guess I'm assuming the outhouse and mead exhibit is the plan, right? That goes
That's
on
the
for
plan.
5 years or however long, and that it seems to me that's separate from conditions that would have to do with just maintaining the landscaping. There's actually specific reporting and measurement and reporting provisions there that are going to cost somebody money. And so, not to be blunt, I guess, but if people buy houses and the homeowners association falls into disrepair and people give up on the houses, how does the city make sure that the part of the conditions that could have made this attractive at this time are carried out, or are there no absolutes?
What we do have in the conditions is under D9 is the applicant's required to submit a contract to implement the mitigation monitoring and reporting program. So we would have a contract in place with the people that would actually be doing that work, and that contract would be reviewed by staff to verify that everything in the MMRP is included.
But I guess what you're telling me that if it fails, it just fails, right?
Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
If I may take a shot at this, I think that I think Commissioner Jordan's question is actually stepping back a little bit from the conditions of approval into a more general question of how do we enforce these conditions and how does it play out in an economic world such as we have right now, where people are losing their homes. And one thing for the Commission to keep in mind is that these requirements and these conditions regarding the maintenance and the design and improvement of these parcels will be recorded conditions that will travel with the ownership of the land. We are dealing with a special situation here, which is there's dirt. Somebody will own this dirt, whether it is the Madsons now, the future buyers of these lots, their banks after a foreclosure, should that unfortunately happen. We hope it won't. There's someone who's going to own this land and be responsible for the condition of the land going forward. And so, yes, there will be conditions of approval. There will be CC&Rs at a minimum. Even if this project wasn't next to the creek, there would be CC&Rs in order to maintain this private driveway that crosses 3 of the lots. So there will be mechanisms for the enforcement of these conditions. We hope that the city doesn't have to get involved in the enforcement of those conditions, that the property owners themselves will take on that responsibility and one of the things that our private CC&R requirements are that the property owners themselves actually have a mechanism for forcing one another to keep up with these conditions. We hope that that will be sufficient to have them follow through and that the city doesn't have to get involved. But ultimately, the city will have the right to enforce those CC&Rs as well.
Do you think this? I guess so. In my lifetime, I'm just comparing it to Veronica Meadows, and my recollection of Veronica Meadows was that part of the component of that project was those improvements had a timeline to be done and completed or funded before occupancy, maybe, or before some point. Is that of a larger scope that this isn't, or kind of drawing that comparison?
I wouldn't make a direct comparison between these two projects. In general, the proposal on Veronica Meadows was proposed by the applicant, and that applicant really went very far in recognition regarding the proposed impacts associated with that project, and proposed a fairly grandiose plan and said, I will do this ahead of time in order to get my approvals. And if that helps the commission and ultimately the city council approve my subdivision, that's what I'll do. And so it's hard to compare something where that applicant, recognizing the nature of that project, proposed something on its own as a way of getting to their ultimate goal. This applicant, I think, is proposing something as laudable. How it frames out is, again, that's this applicant's proposal.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Gullett, I'm particularly, I guess, when we're talking the oaks, I'm particularly concerned about the 2 oaks that are up on parcel 1. And I squinted really hard at my paperwork a couple nights ago, but so I'm just recollecting now, because I'm certainly not going to squint on my lesser ones. But it seems to me number 1 was about a 30-inch diameter. Does that sound right, give or take?
That sounds right.
Okay.
I can verify.
What do you think the age of that tree is?
I don't have a guess. It's beyond my education.
Okay. Does anybody in the commission know? Mr. Justice? Okay. And what's the age of a 15-gallon nursery oak? Anybody want to hazard a guess on that one? I mean, pretty young, right? Okay. I mean, okay. So 100 years old for a 30. Okay. Ms. Plowman, do you have more?
Oh, I was
oak
just going to
insight
say
for
it's
me?
depending on, I've spent a lot of time working on oak trees in my career. So I know that they're important to preserve, and I think our client has tried to do that to the greatest degree possible. But I think probably a 15-gallon oak's a few years old.
Okay.
Maybe 5 years old, but remember that you plant a 3-to-1 ratio.
Right.
And there's some question, maybe you plant 10 1-gallons.
Right.
So that, people have different perspectives on that. Okay. But, yeah, so the goal is to get 1 for 1.
All right, and while you're up, I found another one in my scribblings for you. On this notion, or this talk I've heard of, that, maybe the difference between the 35 and the 50, maybe it's not static, maybe it's 50 in some places and 35 in the others, like 35 where the existing historical house is. I'm unclear what part of that is actually staying right there. Would actually just part of that existing house stay?
Can you make that a full slide? Yeah. There we go. So what happens is you can see the facade is outlined right here. Mm-hmm. The facade and just around the edges is what stays.
Okay, so the frontage as I would view it.
Yeah, and then you would extend back. I mean, the concept that's being developed for that lot to preserve this extends the house back, which was a logical extension of a wall, because you have to preserve this part of the wall too, and the front door. That's part of it. So the house would extend back to meet the setback, and then. So the shape of it's not going to change significantly. It's just that it'll be rebuilt.
But the only part of the requirement is the front.
The front extending around the corner and including the front door.
Okay. How far does that go on that right-hand corner? How far do you think that goes from the front corner backwards up the hill?
I'm guessing it's about 10 or 15 feet.
So it's getting close to one room.
Yeah, it's the living room.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and they're preserving that living room.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'm recalling our review of those citrus groves with our urban historian. We looked at photos from 1940 and 1952, and in 1952, those oak trees weren't there.
Great, thank you. Mr. Justice, I believe you have more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know you want to move this on, as I do. I just have 2 final questions. One's for Mr. Johnson, and I was curious as to whether the effect of the Hasacita fire has been taken into account in terms of the stream dynamics and increase in the runoff rates, in terms of your expectations for a 50-foot as opposed to a 35-foot, and just if you could just briefly give us a snapshot, big picture, as to why you want 50 as opposed to 35. How does it fit into the numerous discussions we've had on a planning level as pertains to this site?
Chair, Commissioner Jostes, First off, regarding the Jesucita fire, flood control does anticipate the potential for heavy loads of sediment to come down. That can fill a channel and then overflow the banks of the creek. And so that kind of leads into my next statement about if you're looking at the bigger picture, the larger view of creeks, they tend to move over time. And so you never really know what's going to happen to them. And you do have catastrophic events, whether they're floods like the 95 event or debris flows that can occur after fires. And because of that, it's always better to give a little more room for the creek to accommodate that and move your structures back so that in case that does happen, you're at less risk of flooding. And then the areas that you restore and the trees that you plant in those areas, you still have some kind of buffer between the buildings if your creek does tend to move toward the building. So that is also another reason why to have a larger buffer because of that reason. And one more statement I will make is the biological opinion for the site did recommend 25 feet, but all the literature that we've searched, scientific literature on buffers, has recommended a minimum of 50 feet to protect biological resources. So that's another reason why we recommend the 50-foot setback.
Thank you. Last question is, I think some of the confusion and questioning has to do with us being a little out of practice here and looking at a subdivision, but this is a subdivision only. There's not going to be construction of specific residences at this time. So you'll put in your public improvements or your private improvements, get the pads ready for construction of housing. Will the restoration plan start immediately? Will the trees with X's on them on the site plan, will those be removed during grading, or will those be left for a time until each lot is sold? And just give us a little bit of more detail on how this rolls out.
Sure, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Joseph. Many of the things that are the common area improvements have to be installed prior to map recordation, because there's no guarantee once the lots are sold that the improvements will be put in. You don't want somebody to end up with a lot with no way to get to it and no services to it. So that's how things will progress. So the common area improvements will be put in prior to recording the map. The individual lots will be then sold off. We know that Ms. Madsen is going to be moving forward with a design on her home relatively soon, because that's a guarantee that house is going to be reconstructed. But I think the idea is put in the common area improvements with as little disturbance as possible to the area, I think. And I believe, Dan, can you remind me of the timing of the mitigation or the restoration? We're not going to be doing that until construction is the way I recall it, because what we have to do is as I indicated, was we want to keep that driveway to allow for some construction equipment to either be staged or whatnot. So the timing of the actual restoration is not set in stone just yet. And certainly the preservation of the trees is going to happen as long as we possibly can. I mean, there's no intent to go in and remove any of these trees until they're ready to build a house there. And that was actually one of Single Family Design Review Board's requirements, is that we did that. But the timing really depends on when some of those homes are constructed, and it's sort of uncertain at this point in time. Yeah. I think one thing that might be beneficial to note, and we haven't really discussed it today, is the fact that each of these lots is required to provide a private yard of 1,250 square feet. So that is something that's good, and that'll be contiguous space. So that is something that will also be provided in these development envelopes, which then again further reduces the area that you would develop with the house or any kind of impermeable surfaces, although you can have some patios in those private yards.
Mr. Cato.
Mr. Chair, that's not actually true. The open yard doesn't have to be usable anymore. I don't know if you guys remember the zoning ordinance amendments. It can be visual or it can be usable, and it can be in that the 50-foot setback. You just can't put a patio in it. It still counts.
Right. And I think, thank you for the clarification there. they're going to provide, the intent is to provide usable patio area, because it would certainly be sort of it's an opportunity for people to enjoy this great resource that's on the property. And I think the intent is to put the usable yard, obviously the usable yard area within that envelope.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs, I believe you have more questions?
Yeah, I do. I have one more. I didn't quite get a clear picture of one thing, and it has to do with the conditions of approval, item 1A, and the order of development. And when we get to it, the first thing that happens, always design review approvals, then some fees get paid, and then the demolition permit is issued. And I guess my concern is that there's demolition that is not going to make much difference one way or the other because they're not historic structures, but then there's demolition that could impinge on the historic structure by virtue of creation of Parcel 2 and Parcel 3. And so I wanted to know if there's any more distinct language that we could use. It says a building, it may not be obtained to demolish non-conflicting structures or improvements. That seems a little vague to me. And the reason I bring it up is because of what happened at the Alan Canto, where a historic structure was designated, remodeling was supposed to happen, and then almost in the blink of an eye, the whole building was gone. And so I remember that as a sad occasion in demolition of historic buildings, and I just want to identify, can we make a better timeline or a more specific text to make sure that doesn't happen in this smaller project?
Okay, Mr. Chair, so that clause about non-conflicting structures and improvements, so the existing footprint goes across the proposed property lines, and it goes into proposed setbacks. So prior to map recordation, this will have to be resolved. And under B3, there's a condition for alterations to the residents, and it requires a design review to the change to the historic structure. And depending on what's proposed, it could be something that goes to Historic Landmarks Commission if staff feels that those elements that were determined to be potentially historic were being altered adversely. Otherwise, it would go to Single Family Design Board and be reviewed at the same time the subdivision grading plan and everything else would be reviewed.
I just wish we had a kind of category A and category B when we use that word demolition, because demolition is demolition.
Mm-hmm.
And I know once it gets a little bit beyond this commission and gets into building permits and so on, that fine distinction that we might see might be not so clear.
Mr. Cato, you wanted to chime in on that?
Yeah, I just want to understand Commissioner Jacobs' concern. So are you saying that, see, the way these conditions are laid out, they have to get their design review approval, and that includes whatever they're going to do to the historic building, right? They have to get that final approval, and then they can pull the demo permit for the demolition of the garage in the house, or sorry, the garage in the apartment building, and those portions of the historic building that got approval from the design review. That's kind of inherent in our process, that you go through design review first and get your approvals. If your concern is that they go through the design review approvals and then demolish the whole building anyway, I mean, there's no language that we can put in conditions that it's going to prevent that. You know what I'm saying?
So design review approvals to obtain required design review approvals is for all 4 parcels?
No. It's for the subdivision approvals and as
Driveways for landscaping.
And the residential alterations as shown in B3. Condition B3 says you have to figure out what you're going to do with that remaining house as part of your initial design review, and then you can pull your building permits for the demo.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure that the language is clear enough.
Mr. Chair, one of the things the Commission should understand is that the city's demolition ordinance covers the partial demolition of potentially historic structures. And so there's a whole process laid out in Chapter 2222 of the Municipal Code. So rewriting those provisions here in the conditions of approval would be redundant. The applicant will have to get design review of any demolition that will occur to that historic structure. For the part right now, the plan, the conditions of approval are saying that this project will retain that facade. That condition will be carried out by the HLC or by design review staff in reviewing the proposed partial demolition of that structure. The timing of it is necessary, as Mr. Gullett explained, because that it has to come before the map, because that existing structure, the northern part of that existing structure, actually straddles lots 3 and 2, as well as the setbacks. So that's why you see the timing. That timing will require design review, and I'm not sure what more the city could put in the middle of all of this, in the sense of that's what we do. We have our design review. That review has to occur. The building permit or the demolition permit is not issued until that design review occurs, and so those are the plans that come out of that design review are what direct and dictate the scope of the demolition. I'm not sure what else we could do other than that.
That's it.
Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to get clear on the development envelope. If the future owner wants to put in a patio, that has to be within the development envelope? Okay, thank you.
Boy, I'm trying to remember what my questions were now. Anyway, I have a list, so bear with me here. I'll try and go in some logical order, if that's possible. When I was at the site visit on Tuesday, I think I asked Dan Gullett if he could provide us a little background on the history of the proposal and how it got here in its current configuration with 4 lots, since it originally started out as a 5-lot proposal. It'd be curious to see how it has evolved before we have what's before us now.
Mr. Chair, I believe the first time the city reviewed development on this property was in 2000, and there was a pre-application review that was completed for a proposal for a 5-lot subdivision, and this is a scanned copy of the plan that's in the planning file. So that PRT proposal included retention of the existing building, and then 2 lots fronting San Remo, and then 2 lots at the northern property line. And in that review, city staff indicated that a 25 to 50 foot setback from the creek top of bank would be appropriate, but also asked for information on biology, geology, and further information on slopes and typical things that are asked for in a pre-application review for staff to determine supportability of the project. So the applicant resubmitted the application in 2009, and in the lot configuration that we see today, but with the submittal of the applicant was originally proposing a 25-foot creek setback, which they extended to 35.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. I think Commissioner Larson asked about the historic structures report. It seems like since so much of the basis of our decision is, based on, without that report, that the existing house is eligible as a structure of merit due to its street presence and architecture, and it would have been nice to have actually had that report rather than a lot of the other reports that we had. And knowing that, I looked up the project. I'm or at least the existing house. I'm quite familiar with it. I grew up nearly adjacent to it, and it's well featured in the Santa Barbara Architecture magazine. I wanted to make sure that my fellow commissioners and others at least had copies of what is there. And this is really the street presence that was historical. The existing condition with all the hedges and the narrow view corridor are not the bulk of the history of this house. It was always very open to the street. Here's other copies. And I just wanted them to really have the benefit of what the historical street presence of that structure was. This was the grand estate of that neighborhood before the subdivisions all occurred. So, and I've known many of the prior owners of this property, and I believe this picture was probably taken in maybe the early 70s, and this was the condition that I remember it in, very well manicured. It doesn't look, as it does today with the growth, especially along the street. So I just wanted my commissioners to see what the historical presence of this house is all about, since we did not get that historic structures report. I also wanted to know how far back is the face of that historic structure from San Remo, as it's now been widened. Since our plans are not scalable, I'm assuming it's 120, 140 feet maybe. If you could give us a clue on that, since that's kind of the basis of the cone for your view corridor. And relative to that view corridor, I'm curious as to what is actually the street opening at the street frontage, because it looks like it is a peekaboo view where we have a very, very narrow opening along the street and then it cones out toward the face of the house.
Mr. Chair, the distance that facade is from the street is just a little over 150 feet.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was concentrating on that when you asked about the second element.
I mean, what's the width of the opening where you start your view at the back of the sidewalk? Because of the way the diagram is shown on the plans, it looks very narrow.
Yeah,
okay, so it's not restricted to that width? That isn't the intent of that diagram on the plan?
But the way you're correct in the sense that the way the easement has been drawn provides that viewing area of the facade and the sort of mound that.
So that diagram is designed to be the equivalent of what you can see now with the driveway and the vegetation that's in place?
That's correct. Okay. That's correct. But it does mark where the easement is. I mean, that is, you can see it on the grading and drainage plan. Right. It shows you where that easement is, and the intent is to provide
those lines define the boundaries of that easement?
They do.
Okay.
They do.
Also, the staff report indicates that the current land is 2 parcels, but I don't see a line designating that, so I'm curious where that parcel...
I believe it's 2 assessor parcels and 1 legal parcel.
Okay. And then, while you're at the podium, the slide that you had up regarding the development envelopes for the different lots, with the 2 different setback scenarios, those numbers seem very different than what we're seeing in the staff report. So I'm trying to figure out, is the difference only the driveway that you showed on lot 1? Because lot 1 on here is the 5387. So I'm assuming you subtracted out a theoretical driveway then in that lot?
Yes, we did. Exactly. So we took about 800 square feet out of...
and then even lot 4 is different for some reason.
Right, but this is with a...
I doubt by the street it was 3215. Maybe it's just a typo on the...
You know what? I'm going to have to look at that, how we came to that. Yeah. I'm a little puzzled by that. I'll take a look at that and come back to you.
Okay. And Mr. Gullett, did the historic structures report really talk more about the street presence, how they define that? Is there a width or a length along the street? Because the way that view corridor is aligned currently, if we were to go to that plan, and extend it out. It also aligns directly with the huge sycamore tree that's in the island. So, I mean, you're not going to have that view from the south side of San Remo. You'll only have it on the north side.
I'll look back to verify, but from my recollection, it includes the view corridor that we see on the plans, but it doesn't specifically analyze a width in the text of the historic structures report.
And then, either Mr. Cotto or yourself, I know we had some discussion at the site visit also about the height of all the hedges directly at the front right-of-way line relative to the temporary suspension of the current hedge ordinance, and some of the hedges would need to be removed for safety purposes when they're adjacent to driveways, but others might remain. Could you elaborate on what can legally be trimmed and what is taboo at this point?
The current suspension ordinance applies to hedges within 10 feet of the front property line.
Okay.
So those hedges are not enforced upon currently, but the suspension ordinance does not include hedges within 10 feet of the driveway for a distance of 20 feet back from the right-of-way.
So that part is currently enforceable while the suspension is in place, but the hedge along the right-of-way line is not if it's far enough away from the driveway?
That's my understanding, that it wouldn't be enforced, and that's something that staff would look at in the plan review during building plan check, that the hedges conform to the city standards.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Cotto?
Yeah. Excuse me, it's a little bit of a gray area. That the suspension of the enforcement, that definitely holds true for enforcement cases, right? If somebody complains about a hedge and it's a front,
but for proposed development, it's a different deal.
Yeah, we have required as part of a development plan. In some cases we have, in some cases we haven't required that hedge to be reduced in height as a condition of approval. Okay. Which is different than
right. So it's not an enforcement. Okay. Correct. It's only the enforcement component that's on suspension then.
Yes.
Okay, that really helps. Mr. Jordan, question or comment? Or motion?
You gave me enough time. I thought of another question.
Mr.
Geller?
You've had more time than the applicant now.
Thank you.
You have to share.
Well, I didn't want to make Mr. Johnson's time go to waste either. I'm just curious between the two of you on the restoration plans, the mitigation and restoration plans. It just references being reviewed by the city. Seems to me the Bath Street project, that one went to the environmental officer or analyst. Is the same situation here, or does this actually involve the Creeks Division? I know I get into this discussion every time and somebody wants to point me to the difference between private property and public property, but what would be the role of the Creeks Division in this particular project?
I think it would be actually good to include the Creeks Division in the review of that restoration plan,
okay.
and
So
would recommend that
just be a note to make at the proper time? Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I did have one question, actually, that I forgot. Can you explain the jurisdiction of the Single Family Design Board versus HLC when it comes to the structure on Lot 3?
The municipal code allows for staff discretion on what design review board reviews alterations to that structure. Some portions of that structure were identified as historically significant, and if those elements are not being altered, then the jurisdiction would be Single Family Design Board. Otherwise, it would go to Historic Landmarks Commission, and that's something we would review with a city urban historian before it was assigned a design board.
But the determination as to the extent of demolition, would that fall with landmarks?
It would only if those portions determined to be historically significant were proposed for demolition.
Okay. So it's accurately enough defined that it could stay with single-family design board unless somebody deviates from that standard?
That's right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Oh.
you caught an error in my slide. That's what happens when you hurry.
That's my job.
What happened was we talked internally trying to decide what the area that driveway might take up, and there was some debate about whether it's going to be around 1,300 square feet or 800 square feet. And so what you see reflecting here on Lot 1 is that a 1,300 square foot reduction in that building envelope based on the driveway. So if it ended up being 800 feet, you'd have another 300 or...
Right, I just didn't realize why Lot 4 changed. It seemed like, I think that's probably just a transposition, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, with basically what we're trying to depict is you're going to have a driveway that comes up there that's going to take up a portion of the buildable area that reduces your envelope. And then actually, I transposed the numbers on 4.
Perfect, okay.
So, yeah.
Great, thanks for the clarification. Okay, I think we're ready for comments. Mr. Justice.
I'll try to kick things off here. Part of the number of questions that we had today, to my mind, relates to how confident the commission is, at least how confident this commissioner is as far as this project goes. And to cut to the chase, from my standpoint, this is a very constrained site. Over nearly or close to half of the site is consumed by either the creek or the creek setback, whether you talk about a 35-foot or a 50-foot. That doesn't leave a lot left over for the applicant to try to work with. Putting the road on the west side as well as the trees on the south create a very, very constrained site. And so I really cannot support 4 units on this site in this particular form. I think it's one too many, or I think the project needs to be reworked into the dreaded PRD zone. I don't know whether that's even applicable in this zone, but I remember the Chase property being the subject of a PRD zone, and it's designed to try to give a little bit more flexibility. But I just can't see 4 units. 3 units, I think, would give a lot more flexibility to the applicant, being able to move the facade of that structure with historic merit to it would give even greater flexibility, but I don't know whether the Landmarks Committee would go for that. To cut to the chase, what I can support would be expanded oak tree protections. I'm worried that the building envelopes are just too tight up against the 2 oak trees and the redwood tree. On Lot 4, I believe it is, on the southernmost portion of the property. I'm concerned that the road itself, the access road coming into the site, if it's 20 feet, I think we should go to whatever is the absolute minimum that the fire department will allow. And if that's 16, that would cut down on more hardscape, even though it's permeable. I fully support the 50-foot setback that the Creeks Division has put forth. I understand the perspective that the applicant has put forth in terms of the marginal impact of 35 versus 50, and I appreciate the comments that were made, but I'm going to err on the side of the bigger picture long term. And I think we need to, if this project goes forward, a couple of other things that would make a nice addition would be to establish some type of an on-site nursery for seedlings and saplings early on, so that you could take advantage of all those little oak trees that are starting to poke their heads up all around the site. I saw a lot of those. And to, I think either go with a 3-lot subdivision or move it towards a redesign in the form of a PRD, because if you could get 4, you might be able to get a little bit more flexibility using that approach. But as it stands now, I cannot support it.
Thank you, Mr. Josephs. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to comment. I want to say I was really struck by the beauty of that house, but I was kind of dismayed that it has been allowed to fall into some disrepair that might not be too simple, too difficult cosmetically to fix, like just some of the balcony details, but that nothing's been done. And demolition to neglect, by neglect comes to mind. You know, you got a tall hedge, and behind it, this historic resource that's crumbling. The facade is crumbling, and I think that's a shame. That being said, the applicant's been here in 2009, and again in 2010. So the applicant knows. I'm not going to say, and then certainly the architect and his fine team knows what the constraints of the site are. And my comments are not going to be too different from Commissioner Justice's. I had already drawn an X on parcel 4, because for two reasons. One, I think it crowds things. Two is it really does take away from a historic view of a beautiful house for the neighborhood. And so, you know, I can't approve this today because I think it needs more work. On the other hand, though, in sites previously we've seen, I did want to make a comment about the oaks, that as we plant oaks, you can use different sizes, you know, as you first plant them and they grow. It looks like it occurred over time instead of all planted at the same time. But maintaining that facade and the view of that facade is very important to me and to that neighborhood. And so, and I have to say, I'm sorry I didn't get the historic information right off the bat because, you know, and I appreciate the chair's bringing a photograph of the house as it was. But I do remember when I first moved here 40 years ago and we were touring neighborhoods we wanted to live in, I remember going past this and it was fabulous. And I just thought, oh, wouldn't I love to live in a place like that, in a beautiful place like Santa Barbara. And it is. It's a beautiful place. It's a lovely site. Setback for the creek, I'm a 50-footer for there. That channel is very deep. And if you look at, as you walk back in the site, it changes in depth and width both. So, and there is a remarkable structure that's supposed to prevent, I guess it's logs that hurtle down the creek from shooting underneath the bridge. It's that big, I don't know how to describe it even. It's just a big stay putter or something, you know, that rises up out of the bottom of the creek. It's like a skip router for diversion beam. Thank you. Thank you very much. But that says volumes about what comes down that creek. So 50-foot setback. We see it around town now where people are having problems with changes in movement in earth. So that's important to maintain and for the health of the habitat. So that's about all I have to say. I agree with Commissioner Justice. I can't support it today. I could support something, but not this. Thank you.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start with my positives. First, from what Mr. Pikert relayed to us on the site visit, I appreciate that you've reached out to the neighbors, and especially the neighbor in the back or to the north, who could potentially have had some concerns about the future of what's to be with this property. So I want to compliment you on that. And also for proactively making a commitment to an investment in restoring the riparian habitat without us having to ask for it or condition it. Appreciate that that's part of the Mattson family's valuing of the heritage that they've had on the property and the special quality of the property and in that neighborhood. There are many challenges with the property, as some of my colleagues have already said, and I think that with long-time I'll call it both neglect and abuse of the creek. We have an important opportunity and a responsibility as a decision-making body for the city to ensure that the proper steps are taken now to respect it, to restore, and to protect long-term. So at this point, I'm inclined to support a 50-foot setback unless I hear otherwise from the majority of my colleagues. I could possibly support 4 parcels or 4 lots, but the way they're configured now and from the plans as we've heard them today concern me. One of my primary interests, which is why, Ms. Palman, I asked that you put the view corridor slide back up, is that we have a very important opportunity and I think, again, an obligation to do what we can to honor this historic home, or at least the facade of it, as Alex Cole has called out. I'd like to see the view corridor opened up more. If the facade on the newly built home for Ms. Mattson needs to be brought forward towards San Remo, I'd like to see that. But this is of paramount importance, I think, to the history of that neighborhood and in honoring this architectural gem in Santa Barbara. And I, too, was dismayed to hear from Mr. Pikert how deteriorated the structure is. I'm even surprised that any of it is can be retained, quite frankly, from the description that you gave us at the site visit. So if something can be retained, that's great, but I think we need to go above and beyond, or I would ask the applicant to go above and beyond to do what she can, what they can, to bring it forward, to utilize it in a way that really respects it and celebrates it. Are you? I see maybe a look of puzzlement by Ms. Mattson. Did you?
You can't move the structure.
Well, we're told we have to keep it where it is, but then you're saying move it forward.
You'll need to come up to the microphone.
So I'm confused by what you mean by bring it forward.
I think the confused look is that part of the HLC approval and the approval of the historic report was to leave it in situ, if you will, and that, because that view and that expanse of the landscaping was an important part of
So
it.
you're simply going to apply it to a brand new structure in essence, on that same site, in that same footprint. Is that correct? Okay. Well, then I go back to my comment, and I'll just succinctly say, if you can open this up, I'm seeing the 3 arches. I'm looking at the original photograph that we have here, and I think there's more that can be done in opening up the view corridor, or I'm asking that more be done to further respect the grandeur of the design of the original architecture in whatever way is possible. I appreciate the relocation of the driveway. I think that's a good move on the part of this development. I think it's going to allow for the riparian restoration that you've proposed, and to allow for a safe left turn onto San Remo, as opposed to the current scenario, which is to make a right and then a U-turn, I think is an improvement to the ingress, egress, and traffic circulation there. I think just a couple of more comments here. Let me go back to Alex Cole's report, recommendation of structure of merit. I would like to see the HLC carry that forward as a condition of approval, if my colleagues would support me in that. And with that, I'll close by saying that I think that the vegetation of the mature trees in particular need to be retained and protected to the greatest extent possible. This is such a unique property and one of the few remaining properties with this wonderful mature vegetation in now what's become pretty suburban neighborhood in Santa Barbara. We're a long way from the citrus grove days of that area. So I'd like to see perhaps a more ambitious or aggressive plan to retain some of the trees. Perhaps we don't have the full plan with us at this point, but going forward, I would be interested in, I would be supporting that sort of plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, surprisingly, everybody has started off a little harsher than I was going to. So I echo many of the comments, but I was not adverse to 4 parcels, although it was clear to me that the way your parcels were being laid out were reflecting probably a desire to be like a horizontal orientation to San Remo, and it's clear to me that perhaps the historic house is going to be able to maintain that, but everything else is going to develop as a perpendicular orientation away from San Remo. And I've said before in dealings with setbacks or buffers or whatever we're legally going to call them, is it's really not important to the amount of feet. It's really what you do with the feet that counts. And I recognize that the applicant could be here with the same request and offering absolutely no restoration plan at all. And there's a balance somewhere on how you're going to develop these lots and what you can sell them for versus what you can offer back to do a restoration plan or not. And there's a tricky tipping point somewhere that I have no concept of where that balancing point actually is. So I think you're going to hear that less lots is more preferred, and you're going to be back here. I would support that. I am generally in support of the larger setback line of 50 foot. I would be happy to support watching that line jog on what is now parcel 3, where the historic building is, so that it's 50 feet until it gets to the what would probably be the frontage of the historic building, and then travel right and turn the corner and go a reasonable amount of space for historic purposes, and then jog back to 50 feet again. And nobody likes to work in lines like that, but I wouldn't have any problem supporting that. I echo Commissioner Schwartz's view of the almost absurd view easement coming up that drive, or the existing driveway. I would only support in the future an enlargement of that width to the west or the left if you're standing on San Remo, and for 2 reasons. One, that you take 3 steps and you're by, even though it's much wider up at the historic house, but down at the street level you take 3 steps and you've lost it. The picture that Commissioner Bartlett handed out is rather sobering versus what's shown on the street right now, those pictures. And it will also, if this plan can find a way to come back with a restoration plan, it will also allow passerbys to have a better access or better view of the results of that plan, also looking up along the property that way, and not simply just get a glimpse as you walk by as to what might be in there. Since I have some other less important comments, but I think it's obvious that this will be back, so I'll just save those. And again, I would like to commend the owners for bringing this forward in a manner that does look to involve, excuse me, a restoration plan and not just a subdivision and live with what's there. That I'm happy to see they're recognizing the jewel that they're sitting on, and I'd encourage them to find a way to come back and continue to make that a component of the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with most of the comments my colleagues have made. One of the things about creating another lot in front of the historic resource, the historic house, is that it just completely changes the context, and you just can't see it anymore, really. And the comments that Mr. Jordan just made about the view, it almost seems like, well, HLC was trying to save something of the context by providing for the view corridor, but I really don't think that works. I also support the 50-foot setback, although curving around the historic part of the house to 35 feet further. But that's all for me.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett and fellow commissioners. See if I can read my scribbled notes. I think we're probably looking at a continuance. I'm not hearing that people want to make a denial outright, but also I don't see the support for the project as it's presented today, and I could not support it as it's presented today either. Looking at the surrounding suburban tracts, it's kind of tempting to say, well, we could make that cookie cutter approach to this piece of property, but the piece of property is much more constrained than what's around it because of the trees and because of the creek and because of the historic house that's on the site. So treating it in a cookie cutter approach is not really going to work. And I would be willing to encourage a continuance and ask the applicant to come back with a new map, and the new map needs to show a couple of things. It needs to show the proposed turnaround at the end of the driveway, a 50-foot setback with the exception of how the setback would go around the historic structure. The historic facade should be specifically delineated so that we can really tell clearly on the parcel what it is that is proposed to be saved from destruction or demolition. And just on a sidebar for that, if when we talk about historic buildings and how they're difficult to move and how they fall apart and so on, one Edwards and Plunkett building that has been treated to a facelift is the historic airport terminal, which is undergoing renovation and is looking quite nice. 50-foot setback. I would like to see something specifying that the hedge be reduced or in some way treated so that it doesn't become the kind of overgrown barrier that it is right now. And parcel 4 seems to be the incredible shrinking parcel. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller until I just don't know what you could build on it. You could certainly put a tiny, modest little house, a cottage of some sort, but I'm hearing from my colleagues that parcel 4 probably needs to go away in the next revision of this project. But I certainly feel that a subdivision of some type is possible, and that the suggestions of the Commission will make for a really fine amenity to this neighborhood. This neighborhood is not really an urban neighborhood, and we're trying to get away from the typical suburban neighborhood tracts that we've seen over the years, and I think we're trying to define a new suburbanism where pedestrian access to the State Street amenities and so on is encouraged. And you've done that with your pathway along the creek and the decision to landscape the site beautifully. So keep pursuing that. This is a neighborhood where people definitely walk, and see them walking down to State Street and to the cafes and the restaurants that are along there. It's a nice area for pedestrian activity as opposed to the traditional tract houses and cul-de-sacs that don't encourage pedestrian activity. So I think your project is headed in the right direction, and I look forward to seeing it back.
Thank you so much. Well, there's probably no one on the Commission that wants to see this successful and have this restoration occur than myself, and it's hard to not get emotional because my whole childhood evolves around this estate, and the prior owners and I spent a lot of time there. So my memories are really embedded. If there was ever a place in Santa Barbara that I would want to see restored, it's this one. So with that being said, my dedication to this project is to try and make it the best that we can. And I don't want to see an applicant in a position where they have to destroy something to save it, and I feel that this proposal does some of that. So I couldn't support, at least in the current rendition, Lot 4 building in front of the existing historic structure. But I think there's other opportunities, perhaps with 3 lots. Even if the lots become slightly larger, you're more than double the required minimum lot size, that you could perhaps do a performance standard permit and have a second house more subservient to the main house on that lot, and still achieve 4 houses but not have a main house in front of the historic structure. So I ask you to really be creative and look at all the alternatives that are there. I think a lot of your directions are great ones. Moving that driveway to the west, I mean, you should hang on to that. I think the restoration along the creek, I'm a little more flexible on the creek setback, if that means that we can retain the historical setting of the house relative to the street and increase its visibility. I would be more inclined to have a variable setback along the creek that is maybe the equivalent area of a 50-foot setback, but let it meander a little bit. Maybe it could be more in the front where you get the real public benefit, and be closer to 35 from the face of the historic structure north, so that you're not impinging on your development envelope on lots 1 and 2. So I think there may be some trade-offs where there's public benefit and we end up with the equivalent without having a hard and fast line. So I really ask you to, dig deep and come up with these ideas, and I think the Commission will be willing to have some flexibility on the rules if the intent is at least aligning with the direction that those rules are, trying to set forward. So I think this is a good project. I think it also maybe points out the fact that maybe not all lots should be developed to their full potential, and I hope as we move forward with Plan Santa Barbara, maybe this can spur some of the discussion on how we could potentially have a residential TEDR. Maybe there's a more appropriate place in town that we could have the extra residents, but not here. But that's a whole different discussion, and I think it just points out that not all lots really are created equal, and it's not just about the lot area divided by the density that's allowed in the ordinance. So I very much support the notion of the project and the program, but I can't support this proposal. So I ask you to, not give up and try and treat this, what may look like a problem that we've presented to you, treat it as an opportunity, and hopefully maybe there's something better that can come out of it. And obviously this isn't your first attempt after looking at the 5-lot subdivision, so you've got a talented team, and I think you're on a good direction, and I think a continuance would be in order, and I think that perhaps even a concept review, if there's something that you want to run by at an early stage before you invest a lot more effort on a whole new submittal and redoing all the reports. So I would love to hear from the applicant and get some direction as to how they'd like to proceed.
Mr. Chair, just in speaking with our client briefly, I think what she wants to do is preserve her options. She and her family need to think about what impact this has on their estate planning. So there's the potential to come back, and there's the potential to appeal it. So we're not sure. I think there has to be some study of what course they need to take. So my question is to Mr. Vincent, is the best course of action to have the Planning Commission deny the project the way it is now without prejudice, or so that we have the option to bring back a redesigned project, or she has the option to appeal it to the council?
Mr. Chair, I think that at this point a continuance to allow the applicant to certainly provide yourself with the time to evaluate this. The continuance has obviously no prejudice. You would have an opportunity to come back if you find that the applicant wants to avail themselves of some kind of concept review with the commission, see if they're going in the right direction before going any further. So I think a continuance is your most flexible option at this point. A denial, unfortunately, it either forces the applicant to appeal or it puts the applicant into resubmitting and resubmitting essentially with a new plan. So I'd say a continuance holds your place with the most flexibility, and the Commission sounds like they're interested in trying to help shape the next proposal if there was going to be a change to this one.
Okay, and then if she determines that they want to appeal it, we would just come back at some point and then request a denial.
Exactly. I mean, the application would come back to the Commission. At that point, if there are no changes in the project, obviously you would be looking at a denial from the Planning Commission.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so do I have a motion for continuance with guidance to the applicant?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
I'll second.
Do we want to add to that? Do we want to add suggestions?
I think the applicant has been listening as we have made our comments, but I think it's...
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Justice.
The only thing I would add to that, and it's not a formal change to the motion as much as it is, I think, reinforcing an intent on the part of the Planning Commission to see something happen on this parcel, and that this hearing today might be taken as somewhat of a concept review, that we would like to work with you to try to get something that works for everybody.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Well, thank you very much for all your effort and hard work, and it hasn't gone unnoticed, and we hope you will be back soon. Okay, our next item is the administrative agenda, committee and liaison reports. Ms. Larson, is there anything to report on the staff hearing officer level?
I didn't bring one. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
And we did discuss, staff did discuss HLC's revisit of 23 West Victoria. So, 34, and during the lunch meeting. So, yeah, and I was present for that item, and it was very interesting. So if you are interested, it'll be rebroadcast, and you might want to see it.
Great. Well,
Thanks.
thank you. Any other committee or liaison reports? Mr. Jordan.
Well, since Commissioner Lodge doesn't want to say anything, I invited myself to her tour of the airport last week with City Council and some of the planning staff, and I wasn't willing to wait another month or two for our tour, apparently. But I can just tell you, it's quite remarkable to see what's taking place out there, and the changes that are coming, and the improvements, and then how they're going to marry the old building to the new building, and some of the inclusions of the artwork in particular. You just kind of want to. Okay, when's this going to get done? Because it's just looking like it's going to be so much fun. And from just a standpoint of a passenger, the improvements that are coming out there, once you walk the building and kind of get a sense on, here's where you check in, here's where you go upstairs, here's where you wait. It's not a cattle chute anymore. There's actually restrooms. You can actually eat. It's just amazing what that's going to look like. So just wanted to pass that along, since Sheila didn't look like she was going to offer that.
Well, she did photos last time, so I think we're covered, and the rest of us are looking forward to our turn. So, and I know that's in the works on getting something scheduled. So, if there's no other reports, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.